Hey everyone. I won't talk too soon. Just a reminder that tomorrow night we are going to dig deep into the case of Corey Richins. You'll be redirected to that live at the end of today's live podcast streaming of our original series. We are going to jump to it because we're going to cover, at first I thought 2 series, and then I looked at what we have. I'm going to cover sorry, not series, episodes. I'm going to cover 3 episodes today. They're shorter, they're important, and then Monday it means we start fresh on some deep diving into Lori Vallow, Daybell. So we're going to do all 3 episodes this afternoon so that we have a solid cut at the weekend. It's like an ending of a chapter and a beginning of a new chapter on Monday. Hey, everyone. Good to see you all. So we're going to get this started. I'll be here in chat talking with all of you. Hey, Stephanie. Let's see here. And this, by the way, we're going to start this. I've shared that every episode is a drawing that we had done, but this drawing in particular was not done by us. It was done by, or designed, I should say, by Chad Daybell for a book that he drew in the 3rd or 4th grade, I believe. Well, he'll let us know what age he was. Maybe it was 2nd grade. So the cover of this next episode was not designed by us. It was designed by Chad Daybell for his first book, according to Chad. Hidden, a true crime podcast. A forensic psychologist and a journalist explore the hidden motives behind unthinkable crimes while examining our deepest fears along the way.
This marks the last day of the United States of America. By tomorrow, all of mankind, and we will be visible from the Milky Way as a tiny little puff of smoke.
That was the character Charlie Frost from the movie 2012, the same character that Chad Daybell referred to as himself in our last episode. A doomsday character who, in the end, is right. And that is the moment we all learn that Charlie Frost is right and Yellowstone is erupting.
And this is Hidden with Dr. John Mathias.
And this is Lauren Mathias.
This is Tuesday, the day before Chad Daybell has predicted the world will come to an end tomorrow. This also happens to be our son's 3rd birthday today. So we're trying to enjoy it before our imminent demise.
And I guess you could say there's a bit of a hope that Chad Daybell's not right, because while we were recording this on a Tuesday, if you're listening to this, it means that Daybell, unlike Charlie Frost, was not right.
Well, not necessarily, because if you're listening to this on a Wednesday, I don't know what the deadline is. It might be midnight on Wednesday. So if you're listening to this in the late afternoon or early evening, there's still a good 4 or 5 hours left before the world comes to an end.
True. If you're listening to this on Thursday, glad you're here.
If you're listening to this on Thursday, I think a celebration is in order. On the other hand, as Chad and Lori sit in their jail cells, I'm wondering what they're thinking about.
That quote by Charlie Frost, he's watching Yellowstone erupt. And he says this marks the last day of the United States of America, and by tomorrow, all of mankind. And we will be visible from the Milky Way as a tiny little puff of smoke.
And that quote is entirely relevant to our podcast today, which is going to focus on putting the pieces together from our previous episodes. In our first episode, we talked about Chad Daybell's denial of being human. In the second episode, we talked about the idea of insecure attachment. And in the third episode, we talked about closed-mindedness. So I refer to those as the 3-legged stool. Today, we're going to start putting specifics together into this puzzle to figure out Chad and how he arrived at the place where murder was considered to be a viable option.
So where would you start?
I think I would actually back up to the idea of insecure attachment. I want to start there because although this isn't entirely clear, it does appear that Chad Daybell felt neglected as a child. Now, whether he actually was neglected, we could probably debate. But based on his autobiography, there's certainly hints of the fact that he didn't receive enough attention. So in his mind's eye, I think he felt some sense of neglect.
There were 5 children total in the Daybell family. There could be other siblings close to age. The mother she could have been busy with too many children. She could have given Chad ample attention, and he simply felt neglected.
Right. And so that idea of neglect evolved into what I referred to as insecure attachment a few podcasts ago. Insecure attachment essentially means that the child does not develop a stable, secure attachment to a caregiver, and that creates a number of other problems, as we discussed previously. My evidence for that was the fact that Chad really does not focus on relationships or mention relationships in his autobiography. In fact, much of his childhood appears to be devoid of significant relationships, which is a peculiar thing for a child. We could say perhaps that there's some version of autism, or back in the day, we would call it Asperger's. Perhaps there's some of that, which would put us more into the genetic physiological realm. And that could be part of it. Maybe there's no neglect at all. Either way, it appears that there's some type of insecure attachment. If we look at Chad's autobiography, one of the offshoots of insecure attachment is a poor sense of self or low self-esteem. I know we talked about that in our second podcast. There's other things going on, though. I think a lot of children with insecure attachments often feel a strong sense of shame, and they feel insecure, and they feel vulnerable, and there's a sense of weakness. For many children, of course, children that are trying to gain some sense of mastery over the world, that can have a really detrimental impact upon those kids. I think we see that. I think with Chad Daybell, there probably is a great deal of shame. For Chad in particular, I think that shame led to, in many ways, a deep sense of insignificance. There's a lot of evidence for this later that we'll talk about. It's not difficult to go from his poor sense of self-esteem to concerns about not mattering enough, or not being important enough, or not being visible enough in his family, or not getting enough attention. All of that I would lump under the category of insignificance.
Which is exactly like that Charlie Frost quote. He said, "We will be visible from the Milky Way as a tiny little puff of smoke."
Right.
Insignificance.
So this idea of insignificance, it plays a major role in a lot of this story about Chad Daybell. In his autobiography, we see it in a lot of places. There's a number of dating rejections. Last week, I talked about the woman from Florida he was dating who told him, man, you really need to get out there and see the world, because I ain't never been with someone like you that's so sheltered.
And then he thought he saw the world.
He went on a mission, and he thought that his mission, because his mission was in Newark, New Jersey, in a fairly rough area of town, Chad Daybell believed that he became worldly overnight. But the reality is, Chad Daybell did not become worldly or see the world. He entered a mission in Newark, New Jersey, and saw the world through his eyes. He made no attempt to let the world influence him. His job was to influence the world with the world that he brought with him from Springville, Utah, or Rexburg, or wherever he lived at the time. It wasn't that he became more worldly, it's that the world became more like him.
He always filtered the world through what he thought the world was.
In his autobiography, we see some of his dating rejections. He essentially marries Tammy because she's the first female that expresses interest in him. He has few friends in childhood. He tends to be socially isolated, which I think is a form of peer rejection, although he doesn't get into that for obvious reasons. This autobiography has the feel of someone who does not necessarily fit in with his peers, and that is not a part of the in-group. He's not playing sports or involved in a lot of activities with his peers. There's some other interesting things in his childhood that stand out. One is that in the 4th grade, he writes a murder mystery mystery novel that gets him some acclaim. You know, for me, a fourth grader writing a murder mystery is a strange thing. I mean, how did Chad Daybell arrive at the place where he even considered writing about murder in the fourth grade?
And it was his first book. He talks proudly of it, that this was his first book. I don't have the title right in front of me, but it was The Murder of Somebody and His Assistant, 2 people murdered.
The interesting thing is that this is on his mental map. And even though we might see this as something playful, it's peculiar to me that a 9-year-old is contemplating this idea of multiple murders at such a young age. In fact, I would probably say that by then, this feeling of insignificance is starting to become a little more pervasive in his life. This murder mystery, I think, is a way for him to reclaim some power, right?
Absolutely.
He writes this murder mystery. He solves it. He's the hero in the end.
He says that it was in his 4th grade library and that kids could check the book out.
So it gives him some sense of attention. It gives him a little bit of notoriety. He's proud of it. It empowers him a little bit. In his autobiography, he has a picture of the cover that depicts a hawk. Not sure why. The title is The Murder of Dr. J and His Assistant.
There you go.
That's just a little interesting tidbit that stands out. Another interesting tidbit that stands out is Chad talking about his discovery of harming honeybees. This is a quote from Chad's autobiography on page 33. He said, "One day that spring, I was slowly walking home across Memorial Park after school. I saw a honeybee pollinating a dandelion. I peered at it for a moment, then smashed it with my shoe. I spotted another one, then another one. I got a strange satisfaction from it. I kept count, and after about a half an hour, I had killed 120 bees. Then, as I was about to step on another bee, a masculine voice shouted in my ear, 'Hey, stop it. Leave them alone.' I jumped back and looked around, but there wasn't anyone in sight. I was really shook up because the man had sounded really angry. I walked in a circle for a minute, trying to make sense of it. Finally, I realized that maybe an angel was fed up with me killing God's innocent creatures. That incident helped me realize how pathetic I had become, and I decided to start making better choices."
The strange satisfaction. And also, it does already show a lack of conscience, like an angel sitting on his shoulder saying, "Knock it off," rather than his conscience.
I guess you could argue that the voice he hears is his voice, his conscience, but the fact that he has to attribute it to something external to himself is problematic.
Right.
Most of us would recognize that that's our voice, or we would have some type of internal dialogue about such an incident. But Chad doesn't recognize that. He sees it only as some external force that has to direct him, which is really peculiar. I wouldn't suggest that that has anything to do with, say, schizophrenia, but it certainly suggests that his moral compass is somewhat askew, even at this early age, and that he struggles to right the ship internally. In other words, has this child, I don't know how old he is here, 8th grade. So this is in 8th grade. Chad Daybell would have been around 12 or 13. By 12 or 13, most children have developed a fairly reasonable moral compass that has some internal coherence and is not entirely dependent upon outside voices or outside forces dictating our actions. One of the most interesting parts of this is the satisfaction part,
Right.
right? Like anytime a child derives satisfaction from killing of any sort, it's peculiar.
Well, and to kill 120 of them.
That's a lot of bees.
And it was significant enough to Chad to remember it years later and write this down in his autobiography, that he felt a strange satisfaction.
This isn't exactly killing the pet dog. But on the other hand, the interesting part of this to me goes back to this notion of insignificance. And what I mean by that is these are both forms of violence. One is direct, one is indirect. But the violence here is an attempt in some ways to reclaim power. And I think that's a theme that we'll see with Chad Daybell throughout this entire saga, is Chad's attempt to reclaim power. I think when Chad feels powerless or out of control or stuck, there's always this attempt to reclaim power. Probably the most salient example of Chad's response to the sense of insignificance are his 2 near-death experiences. What happens in each of those experiences, and he describes 2 of them, essentially allow Chad to reach beyond the veil, as we discussed last week, and to connect with dead people or spiritual entities. In other words, what happens with his near-death experiences is that Chad becomes godlike. Chad develops an ability that, according to him, very few people other possess. And that ability is to see the future, to know the future, and then
To see through the veil.
to see through the veil, to reach beyond the veil, and to obtain information about the future that few other people have. And that changes everything for Chad.
And as we explained in our last episode, the veil in LDS doctrine means that we can't see God's plan. The veil is put between us and God and the heavens and spirits so that we don't know what is happening.
Chad goes from the social outcast who's socially isolated. He's being rejected in dating. By his own admission, he has low self-esteem. He's probably experiencing a lot of shame. There's some violence in terms of stepping on and killing bees that he's ashamed of, for sure. He then has these near-death experiences, and now all of a sudden he has godlike authority. As I talked about it in the first podcast, this moment, these near-death experiences are really the beginning for Chad in terms of leading to the path that takes him to where we are today. Without these near-death experiences, he has no authority to foresee the future, to create a new Jerusalem, to take on the role of a prophet. And by the way, in that first podcast where I talk about Chad's prophetic yearnings and how he was intent upon denying being human, this provides some of the reasons why. This explains that his prophetic yearnings were a response to this feeling of insignificance and to these feelings of shame and his low self-esteem and the insecure attachment. So all of these things combine to create this godlike state, which is obviously the antithesis of being human, of feeling human, of experiencing shame and vulnerability. And Chad, for whatever reasons, mostly I think to reclaim sense of control and power over the world, or mastery, as we all want to do, he goes to an extreme with this because he's very LDS, because he had just been on a mission. I think that Chad wants to transform these feelings of shame into something that's the opposite of that, which is absolute power. So now we have a kid who essentially is, for lack of a better term, a nobody, and now he's a god. He can see the other side of the veil. He can predict the future. He's going to write books that he believes are prophecies that the church should take seriously. There's a number of things that change for Chad Daybell when he moves from relative outsider to this state of becoming a deity. In a lot of risk assessments or psychological evaluations I do, sometimes I'll sit with someone for hours and I'll feel lost. Even though I've read the case file and I've developed hypotheses before I walk into the prison or jail, a lot of times I'm still looking for that one ingredient that could make sense of everything. No doubt I've spent some time thinking about Chad Daybell.
Have you now?
Trying to find those ingredients. We have the 3 philosophical foundations that we developed in the first 3 podcasts. But there was such an epiphanal moment that I found for Chad Daybell. And it's no different than those moments when I'm in front of an inmate and I feel a little lost. And I'll just throw a question out randomly, hoping for something reasonable. And the inmate will say something completely innocently that they don't understand the implications of. And there it is. Those are those types of epiphanal moments for me where everything makes sense. Fortunately, we have one of those moments in Chad Daybell's book. On page 55, he was a young man at the time, and Chad Daybell says, quote, "I vividly remember walking slowly across the BYU campus during a January snowstorm and thinking, there isn't a soul on earth who cares what I'm doing right now." I knew that statement wasn't completely true. But at home, it seemed life revolved around my other siblings' activities. And at BYU, I had taken general education classes, meaning I was seated with hundreds of students in large auditoriums where I rarely sat by the same person twice. So let me repeat that quote. There isn't a soul on earth who cares what I'm doing right now. If you want to understand Chad Daybell, that's the quote that you would turn to. Because Chad essentially is saying, I feel meaningless. I need to change that. All of us, of course, want to feel some sense of significance and mastery through work or personal projects or in various endeavors that we undertake. And that's not the issue. We all want that. The issue is how far we're willing to go to experience it. Most of us, if we want to feel significance, we do a better job at work. Maybe we step up our game or we go to some additional trainings, right? With Chad Daybell, apparently that wasn't sufficient. He had to turn into a god.
Right.
For Chad Daybell to feel significant, he needed to literally create this persona that could reach into the future and predict the future and acquire a godlike status.
So what happens to Chad Daybell after all of these experiences and he becomes this prophet or godlike figure?
Yeah, so I think that's where the story starts becoming interesting. He gets a prompting to start writing books because he has this special knowledge. I can't remember his first books, but he starts writing a series of books. As we've discussed in previous podcasts, he says quite specifically that his books are simply obtaining information from beyond the veil and then bringing them back to the human realm.
Right. Those are his fictions, which
Right.
are not fictions.
Right. He calls them fiction, but they're in reality, they're not. He doesn't perceive them as fiction.
Right.
And so he starts a publishing company, essentially, I think, to spread the word about his visions and to develop a following, which he does. He picks up people from Vallow and he picks up people from Preparing the People.
I find his publishing company a very important thing in recruiting his accidental cult. We can call it a following, whatever it is. With his publishing company, that gave him the ability to go seek out people who adored him. A perfect example is Julie Rowe. He found Julie Rowe. He said, "Let me publish your book." And as Julie Rowe says on her YouTube podcast, Chad and I would talk every day. For those that aren't familiar with the case, Julie Rowe is an author who had a near-death experience, who was excommunicated from the Mormon church, who does energy work, who originally defended Chad. She's changed her tune once the bodies of the children were found. But Julie Rowe was recruited by Chad through his publishing company. Another is Hector Sosa. He is another author that was recruited by Chad. Chad explains how he knocked on Hector's door and said, "Let me be your ghostwriter. You have a near-death experience to share. It's important to share." And boom, Hector Sosa is adoring Chad. And then soon all of these people are in the speaking circuits along with him. I really feel like he used his publishing company to groom people to find adoration.
Right. And not only to bring people into his cult, if that's the right word, but also to spread the word about his own books.
Yes.
And his own visions. His publishing company really became the platform through which he was able to communicate his godlike visions and to expand the realm of his influence and potentially his cult. The other thing that's interesting about his publishing company is he seeks out famous athletes to work through his publishing company so he can write their biographies, which I think is really fascinating because, again, it shows Chad isn't content just picking out the average Joe to write about. He wants to find the most famous people he can that are willing to interact with him.
Those he considers significant.
Right, exactly. And that give him some social status. He finds athletes, he writes their biographies for them. Again, this enhances this view of how important he is and how special he is. But not all goes according to plan. There's some setbacks for Chad. For one, I think that as his books became more popular and he's on the speaking circuit, I think he fully anticipated that the church would recognize his accomplishments. He felt like his books were in Deseret Book. He expected perhaps that the leadership of the church, maybe the apostles or the group of 70, would take notice and recognize his visions. I think at the very least, he anticipated that he would get a calling to become a bishop, and none of that transpired. That was really probably a great disappointment and a frustration to Chad.
Chad Daybell to not even receive the calling of a bishop, which would be the head of a congregation of a few hundred people. It's like being passed over for a promotion and would be very frustrating for him, I assume.
Right. For somebody who was so invested in the church and someone who, in his mind's eye, played the game and wanted to get ahead and wanted to be promoted within the church, it must have been extremely frustrating for him to not get higher callings to become a bishop, for example. There were other disappointments for Chad as well. His publishing company eventually went bankrupt and he had to go back to work as a cemetery sexton, which, by the way, was work that he had done previously when he was writing many of his books. We've talked about that before. That's an interesting part of this story as well, because when he is taking on this godlike persona, he's working each day in a cemetery. burying people.
He already has a thing for death. Between killing the honeybees and writing his murder mystery, now throw in cemetery sexton and actually digging graves.
This constant exposure to death in the cemetery undoubtedly, in my opinion, impacted his psyche in a negative fashion. I don't think he was able to cope with it. I think part of this response to feelings of insignificance and powerlessness as a child also involved this constant exposure to death. That part of this prophetic persona was a function of increased feelings of insignificance by being around dead people, by being around death. Because ultimately, I think we'd have to say that death is the end of any dreams or aspirations or projects or goals we would have in this world. And so I think Chad was confronted with that day after day. It probably only increased his feelings of insignificance. And I think that the more he was around that, the more he probably sought to solidify this godlike persona. Another element that's important to discuss in this case would be the simple fact that Chad was getting older. In addition to working in the cemetery, marrying the first woman he met, Tammy.
That chapter where he meets Tammy, by the way, is titled A Fast Courtship.
He's been married for 30 years before he meets Lori. I think there's definitely some issues in here about a midlife crisis. His career is not what he anticipated. He's not getting recognition from the church. He's working in a cemetery. He has a publishing company that's gone bankrupt. This has all the trappings of a midlife crisis, right? He's getting older. He hasn't succeeded at the level he expected in any domain. He's picked up weight. He's more sedentary. All of these things would suggest that life is starting to take its toll. He's not the 25-year-old that he was with unlimited hopes and aspirations. He's now a 50-year-old with the clock ticking.
He's become a grandpa. His kids are grown.
His
last kid's on a mission.
Right. His kids are grown. They're leaving the nest. So you've got a series of things that are all coming together. In one of my earlier blog posts, I actually described it as a midlife crisis with a severely delusional twist. Right. And what I meant by that, the delusional twist was thinking that he was a god. The midlife crisis we've just explained. Now we're at the point where the stage is set for this entire saga to start unraveling. All we need now is a femme fatale to enter the picture. And here, I know you all have been waiting for this moment, but here it is. Lori Vallow Daybell is about to become a part of our discussions from here on out.
You've all been waiting for this moment.
Let me just give you a couple of teasers. We still need to finish with Chad, but when Lori enters the picture, everything changes. Most of you have written us comments about, what about Lori? Didn't she play a role? Yes. Lori is the catalyst that sets this bonfire ablaze. She is the combustible, flammable material that just creates a wildfire that cannot be contained. So obviously, yes, Lori plays a massive role in this entire dynamic. It's interesting to think about whether any of this would have happened if either Chad or Lori never met. And it's hard to imagine that it would have. One of the fascinating things about Chad that we haven't talked about, and we will down the road, is whether or not Chad is a psychopath or whether or not Chad is highly antisocial. The reason that's interesting is because almost all murderers or accomplices to murderers, especially murderers of children, have some elements of psychopathy, but it's not clear to me that Chad does. We could argue that there's probably some narcissism, and no, I'm not diagnosing that. I'm just pointing that out as a characteristic, but this is where Lori comes into play. Chad is more passive, and even though Chad has really created the conditions for all this to transpire, I think Lori is the prime mover. Lori sets the ball rolling. She sets this whole thing in motion. That in some ways, Chad needs Lori. Chad needs Lori's encouragement. Chad needs Lori's impetus to act more than anything. And Lori, contrary to Chad, I think is much more of a action-oriented person. She's more of a results-driven person. When Lori wants something, Lori's probably going to find a way to get it, no matter what. It's that combination that makes this so toxic and so dysfunctional. But we'll get back to that more later. When we talk about Lori, I'll be talking about some of the research on filicide, which is killing children.
The parent killing the child.
The parent killing the child. And I'll be talking about, there's some speculation in previous psychological reports that Lori was diagnosed with borderline personality. And that's a very interesting topic to take up. I think we'll be talking about that in some future episodes and how that plays into this dynamic between Chad and Lori. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a teaser.
We will get there.
For future episodes. But for the moment, let's finish our thoughts on Chad. If we're going to look at the underlying motivations for Chad's role in these murders, we might say something as simple as, well, obviously this was sex and money, right? There's insurance money involved, and he wanted to have sex with Lori, and case closed, sex and money.
There you go. Dateline.
There you go. There you go.
Every Dateline episode ever.
Right. Every Dateline or 48 Hours episode is sex, money, revenge. Let's not forget revenge. There's always revenge of some sort somewhere. I saw a murder not too long ago where a customer was slighted. He went in to purchase something trivial. I don't remember what it was. And he believed that the shop owner was ridiculing him, and he came back and killed him. Revenge. So let's not leave out revenge. So is this a case about sex, money, and or revenge? Well, you're listening to Hidden. We're not going to just stop there. Do those elements play a role in this? Yeah, of course. But I think we want to dig a little deeper. We're starting to put some of the pieces together, but now I want to step back, as you guys are, I'm sure, accustomed to at this point, after hopefully listening to our first 3 episodes. I want to step back a little bit and take a bird's eye view. And I want to ask the question, why do human beings murder other human beings? Now, I know that's a really philosophical question, but I think we have to ask that question if we're going to start to solve any murder, and especially this one. It's a very complicated question. There's a lot of different psychological theories about why humans murder other humans. We're not going to answer it today, but I want to open the door a little bit on some of the current thinking on that issue. We'll be picking up a lot of these ideas about why humans kill each other in the future. But let me start with one right now that's a little more obscure and probably not as well known. There's a German anthropologist by the name of Walter Burkert. And Burkert wrote a book in 1972 called Homo Necans. Homo Necans means the killing animal. What Burkert argues essentially is that killing is built into the human condition. Now, he doesn't exactly say if that's genetic or if it's sociological or psychological, but his argument is that humans survived from the very beginning by killing animals, killing prey, in some cases killing other humans for survival, for food. As human communities evolved, what happened was that humans still had to hunt and they had to kill. And again, in some cases, they killed other humans, but they also had to exist with each other in communities. So there became this tension between existing in a cooperative fashion and going out and murdering stuff. So according to Burkert, what happened was human beings created rituals to separate the two. They created rituals, most specifically the ritual of sacrifice. So in order to domesticate this act of killing, human beings found it necessary to develop sacrificial rituals to make it appear more normal and more common. And that way they could bring these violent, aggressive impulses from killing into the community and make it safe. Burkert's argument is that as human communities became more sophisticated and evolved, this never changed, that we still have versions of this today. He even argues that the foundations for many religions can be found through these types of sacrifices and violence. In fact, and please don't find this offensive, this is not just the messenger here, but he argues that even Christianity, where Christ was essentially murdered on the cross, is an act of extreme violence. But it's an act of violence that starts an entire religion. Burkert says that killing is ingrained in the human condition and that we go through these sacrificial rituals all the time. Now, you might be wondering, what does this have to do with Chad Daybell? And the answer to that, and my wife and I, Lauren and I, have talked about this a lot over the dinner table. The answer to that is I really think there was a sacrificial component to these murders. Sad to say, but...
And when you say these murders, we're talking particularly about Tylee and JJ. Is that correct? Or all of them, including Charles, Vallow, and Tammy? Or are we just talking about the children?
I think we're talking more specifically about the children. Tammy was less about sacrifice than about simply being an obstacle to the future that he envisioned, because he was talking about having visions of Tammy dying well before her death. In fact, he talked openly to Julie Rowe about his belief that Tammy would be killed in a car accident. I don't remember when, but several months before when she actually died. Tammy's a little different. If you look at this case, I think it's particularly interesting to think about it in terms of Burkert's notion of sacrifice, because Chad had a history of rejection in the past from women and also from failures like his bankruptcy of the publishing company. All of a sudden, Lori appears in his life. Lori, in some ways, was this fantasy of the perfect female he never had. Lori, too, was an attempt to reclaim power for Chad. Lori allowed him to revisit in midlife all these fantasies he had about beautiful women and erotic women that would seduce him.
The cheerleader, and I say that because he would talk about cheerleaders and football players, and she was a cheerleader.
So this femme fatale walks into your life. You're 49 years old. You already have her attention because you're proclaiming yourself as a god, and she believes it. You're proclaiming yourself as a prophet. You already have her attention because she's read your books. She's smitten with you. And now she's showing interest in you. But you probably don't trust this. If you're Chad Daybell, you probably don't fully trust her intentions. So what better way to test her loyalty than to ask her to sacrifice her children? Talk about the ultimate act of sacrifice, right? If you're a deity, why not ask a person that you're in some ways afraid of, because he must be deathly afraid of rejection from her. Why not ask her to do the unthinkable? What better way to show that she's more committed to him than anything else in her life? Maybe some of you are thinking about the story of Abraham and Isaac, right? But
I am.
I think there's some parallels there, that God wants to test Abraham's loyalty. I have no doubt that Chad Daybell knows that story extremely well. And what Chad Daybell's asking of her is, who do you side with? Do you side with me, the deity, or do you want to spend time and energy on your kids?
Am I significant enough for you? How significant am I?
If there's some credence to this perspective of sacrifice, there's also another component. It's not just about Lori. It's also Chad seeking confirmation of the fact that he's a deity. It's also Chad saying that I can do this. I can murder human beings because I'm a deity, and nothing is more important than that. And this also goes back to Burkert, because one of the things Burkert talked about in the idea of sacrifice was that when you slaughter or kill an animal and then eat it or consume it, then in some sense you attain power from that animal. By killing this creature, you too become somewhat godlike. This is where you get the idea of drinking the blood from an animal that's killed. You drink the blood because now you acquire some of the power from that animal. Sadly, we see this with rhinoceroses. We kill rhinoceroses for their horns because human beings, or at least some human beings, have this misperception that if they consume the horn of the rhinoceros, they'll attain virility and strength and youth. And of course, this is all a myth, but it's related to this idea of sacrifice. When you sacrifice someone or something, and then you consume a part of that creature, or at least you participate in the demise of that creature, then you have exhibited similar godlike qualities. And I think that might be part of the reason. I think there's many other reasons. I've talked about those in another blog post, but that's part of the reason I think Chad buried the body so close to home, because it reminded him, because it was a confirmation of his godlike powers. He could look out in his front yard, as sick as this is, and he could be reminded that he, as a deity, was perfectly fine killing these children. Or at least it was a reminder of the fact that he believed he was godlike. Let's back up a little bit and talk about a few other elements that get us from Chad's godlike status to the murder of several people. One other obvious ploy is Chad's rating system. We've talked about this a lot, but
in every episode, I believe we've brought up Chad's rating system, where he rated individuals light or dark, evil or good.
Chad's rating system allows him to dehumanize these children. If he's testing Lori's loyalty, he's also finding a way to make it more acceptable for her to sacrifice her kids. And the easiest way he can find to do that is to create this entire fiction of light and dark and good and bad and evil and zombies. And once he does that and he gets Lori's buy-in, now he's just a few steps away from having the ability to kill these kids because he's totally dehumanized them. In fact, there's some research suggesting that without some type of dehumanization of others, it's virtually impossible to take the next step of murdering someone. So he dehumanizes the kids through his system. My guess is that he also runs into some problems with Tylee. My guess is that Tylee did not fully accept Chad's belief system and that Tylee probably pushed back against Chad to some degree.
I assume she did as a 16-year-old who could see what was happening.
Tylee presented some real problems to Chad. Tylee is a really interesting part of this equation because she's almost an adult. She's 16, almost 17. She's at a point in her life where she can be independent. So it's really peculiar. Most kids that are killed in filicide are younger. Most kids that are killed by parents typically tend to be 3 or younger. So Tylee is a little bit of an anomaly. The reason why Tylee loses her life is because she infuriated Chad. Tylee upset Chad so much that as the deity he was becoming and as the prophet who would later make a claim to being the prophet of the entire Mormon church, he was not someone who was looking for feedback about his fallibility at that time. Tylee probably told her mother, this guy isn't who he seems to be. This is getting crazy, Mom. I think you really need to pull back. And Lori just wasn't willing to hear that. And when Chad got word of that, I'm sure that her zombie status escalated quickly. Again, this is another way to dehumanize Tylee. Some of the evidence I have for this is the fact that Tylee's body was extremely disfigured and dismembered. And typically you'll see that when there's a lot of rage involved in a crime. It's one thing to kill someone and to bury them in a normal fashion or keep the body intact. It's another thing altogether to intentionally disfigure the body, to take it apart. In some cases, that occurs because perpetrators are attempting to dispose of the body, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. This would provide some evidence for the fact that Chad was extremely angry with her. He was probably very upset that Tylee challenged him. If not directly, then certainly indirectly through Lori. And so Tylee, unfortunately and sadly, paid the price for that. I guess one of the lessons here is if you run into a deity, don't take them on directly. Let's go back. I think the general narrative I'm developing here is someone who felt neglected, someone who was isolated as a child to some degree, who experienced a deep sense of insignificance and inadequacy, who responded to that by developing this belief that he could connect to God, that he was a direct messenger from God, and that in fact he was somewhat of a God himself, or at least a prophet. And then from there, creating a cult, or at least a group that adopted those beliefs and worked on his behalf, which only accelerated when he ran into Lori, who became a catalyst for all of these different extreme beliefs that he probably never would have acted on without her. So as I wind down this episode on Chad, and I hope I've connected some of the pieces, our first 3 podcasts set the stage. Today, I brought in some specifics to argue for why those elements are important. And quickly, the closed-mindedness piece that I talked about in our last podcast is extremely important in all this, because never once does Chad attempt to disconfirm or challenge anything that's going on here. Never once does Chad ever ask the question, am I really a deity? Is any of this really true? So the closed-mindedness part means there's a certain inevitability to this. I think Chad saw this as being deterministic. As I said last week, once this train came off the tracks, there was no stopping it. Chad Daybell had no interest in remaining open or curious enough to get the train back on the tracks. So that piece is also extremely critical. It's maybe not as critical in terms of developing a conceptualization or a narrative of how Chad went from birth to his current predicament. But I think in a nutshell, that's the narrative. And at the center of this narrative is this notion of significance. When I think of that, I think of a psychologist by the name of Eric Kruglansky, who's done some amazing work on closed-mindedness, but he's also looked at terrorism and terrorists. And that is a really interesting parallel here, because terrorists, according to Kruglansky, often, and especially suicide bombers, They often act out of a quest for significance. There's a quote I love from Kruglansky about significance, and I'll just read it quickly here. He says, the threat of insignificance brings with it, quote, the nightmare of ending up as a speck of insignificant dust in an uncaring universe.
That is just like the quote we began with by Charlie Frost in the movie 2012 when he says, and we will be visible from the Milky Way as a tiny little puff of smoke.
Right, exactly. I know, it's crazy how that's related. We've gone from Charlie Frost, the fictional character that Chad Daybell relates to Eric Kruglansky, who's done some of the best research on terrorism and closed-mindedness and cult leaders, to essentially saying the same thing. Chad Daybell does not want to end up as an insignificant speck of dust in the universe. And I think none of us do. You know, I want to maybe end with a little bit of a story here about how when I was working at the VA hospital back in 2003, the SARS epidemic had reached the US and the mortality rate from that was very high. And I remember it was right before the holidays and there were signs all over the VA saying, be careful, wash your hands, blah, blah, blah. And I remember thinking, you know, there's a day left before I'm going to go out of town for the holiday. I'm not going to sweat it. And then the next day I started getting a fever and I started feeling sick. And it was really bad. My fever was 104 for hours. I took all kinds of Tylenol, but the fever wouldn't break. So I went to the hospital. They gave me an antiviral. Thankfully, it worked. And I remember it was probably the sickest I've ever been in my life. I couldn't breathe. My lungs were filling up. And I was afraid. I was living by myself at the time. It was a very difficult time. But one of the things after that incident, one of the things I thought about was, what if this was a lot worse? What if this was airborne and it had a mortality rate above 50%? I don't remember the SARS mortality rate. I think it was fairly high. I was haunted by this idea that a virus like SARS would strike and it would infect most of the population. And essentially that would be the end of civilization. And then, of course, flash forward to 2020 with COVID-19, I'm still haunted by my SARS experience from 03. And I'm thinking, here we go again. What if COVID-19 was much deadlier? I mean, it's horrible. I don't want to underplay it. And I have tremendous sympathy for all the victims who have passed away. But my thought was, what if this was much worse? I couldn't go to work. Our family was quarantined for a month. And I talked to Lauren. I said, you know what? This thing is just bugging me. I need to figure out a way to work this out. So I sat down and I wrote a fictional novel called Immunity. I'm still working on it. I haven't completed it. But Immunity is essentially about a character who's thrown into a pandemic, a deadly pandemic that ends civilization. That character has to figure out more than anything else what really matters to him. As we think about Chad Daybell and we're stuck in the middle of this horrible pandemic, more than ever in my life, I've had to confront this question about what really, really, really matters at the end of the day. If civilization collapsed, if your house and your valuables and your car had no meaning or use anymore, what really matters? When I think about the Chad Daybell case, I'm certainly thinking about that issue. I don't know if Chad Daybell knew himself well enough to be able to answer that question. But I think when you start killing kids or become an accomplice to killing kids, you've really lost sight of what matters to you. When you kill your wife for no apparent reason, when you leave your kids orphaned, essentially, I mean, they're adults. I understand that. You've lost sight of what really matters to you. As I've done in every previous podcast, I want to end with an aspiration here. And that aspiration is, I hope during this time, this difficult time during this pandemic, I hope we can step back and think about what really, really matters to us. In my book, Immunity, my main character, his name's Adam. Adam discovers that what really, really matters to him is family. He has a son, he has a wife. Gee, that sounds familiar. He wants to protect them at all cost. In many cases, he questions whether it's worthwhile going on, but he feels like there's no other choice but to go on. And so he will protect his family at all costs. And that is what matters more than anything else. It doesn't matter how much money he has in the bank because that's worthless. It doesn't matter how nice his house is or his car is, because those get burned to the ground anyway. I wish Chad Daybell had stepped back to self-reflect just a little bit and think about what really matters. I've talked about this before, but Chad Daybell created this fantasy world and he lived in it. And I think he lost sight of that question. The question is not just what matters the most, it's what matters the most here and now, not 10 years from now. And so that's my aspiration. Let's think about that. What matters the most to us? And then my challenge is, can we live according to those values?
Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I know that it was mostly John talking tonight, and he said he'd do that for me because I spent the day making our little boy a bug cake for his birthday before July 22nd, tomorrow, before the end of the world. John said he'd mostly take this one.
But I'll get to enjoy a delicious bug cake later tonight.
Yes, you'll get to enjoy that bug cake tonight, and we'll post pictures of that cake on our Facebook page, which, by the way, we want to share that with you. We do have a Facebook page where we're going to share books that we use, quotes that we share, bug cakes that we make. The Facebook page is Hidden, a true crime podcast, or you can find it through doing @Hidden True Crime. We also have an Instagram @Hidden True Crime, and we also have a Twitter, which is Hidden Crime.
And I should mention our forthcoming website.
Yes.
You can find our website, which we're in the process of completing. It will be at hiddentruecrime.com.
hiddentruecrime.com. Soon there we'll have blogs as well, and we'll be able to share all the blog posts that John has mentioned and that we want to share with all of you. We'll have them compiled into one place. So hopefully by next episode, we'll have that website up. That's our plan. Keep sharing with your friends that they have a seat with us at our dinner table as well. We want to keep doing this, and we're so grateful for the support and the reviews.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been really encouraging to know that some of you are enjoying this and getting something out of our podcast. I think that was our hope when we started this.
If only we didn't have day jobs. John and I have been enjoying this so much, we could spend 40 hours a week on this, but
we will have an empty chair for you at our table for next week. If there is a next week, by the way, if you happen to be listening to this on a Thursday or a Friday, which is after the 22nd, which is when the world will come to an end, then I will feel a great sense of relief. And if there is no Thursday or Friday, then perhaps if you're listening to this on Wednesday night, then I certainly hope you make the most of those last hours on this planet. I feel fairly comfortable that we'll continue this podcast next week, but maybe Chad Daybell's right.
We'll see. Until next episode, next week, we'll have a seat open for you. Until then, good night.
Good night.
Everyone, stay with us. I'm going to switch to the next episode. We're going to do episode 5 now. Psychologist and Hidden, a true crime podcast, a forensic psychologist. Hidden, a true crime podcast, a forensic psychologist and a journalist explore the hidden motives behind unthinkable crimes while examining our deepest fears along the way.
This is Dr. John Mathias.
And this is Lauren Mathias.
And we're happy to be here with our 5th podcast because that means the world has not ended. Yeah, right. We were prepared for the end. We had our son's 3rd birthday party the day before the end of the world. And then, of course, that evening I went on a massive spending spree and went into serious debt thinking that we wouldn't have to repay it. But apparently I'll be returning that boat.
We didn't really buy a boat, but we did buy something. We bought a new house. That part is true. And we moved into the new house when we realized the world wasn't going to end. We moved into the house, and here we are.
There's no boat. Although people apparently own boats in Las Vegas, I wouldn't be one of them.
Right.
There's not a lot of water here, and the water that is here is receding quickly. So a boat probably isn't the best idea. Anyway, if you're listening, thank you. We assume that you too survived the end of the world.
First off, a toast to still being here.
A toast to Chad Daybell's poor powers of prediction. As if you didn't know it, I'm sure you figured out by now that Chad Daybell's powers of prediction are horrendous.
Let's hope you didn't have to learn that by watching the 20-second pass us by. But if you did,
we're glad you're here. There's a few things that from the beginning of this case that Lauren and I don't want to speak for her, but there's a few things from the beginning of this case that I've been completely obsessed with.
I give you permission to speak for me because I think it's fair that we both have been obsessed with these.
Right. And so we have to get them out of our system. And we hope that this will illuminate a little bit more about Chad Daybell. I know we spent a lot of time on Chad.
And Lori, too.
This will help us understand something of Lori. Those two things are the portal. I just can't stop talking about the portal, and neither can our 3-year-old. The other thing is Oprah.
Oprah. We brought her up last time. Oprah is the darkest spirit, according to Lori and Chad. This comes from their best friend, or Lori's best friend, Melanie Gibb, told Keith Morrison this, that Oprah is the darkest spirit of them all. Do you know what that means? Because I thought the darkest spirit of all was Satan. So we're talking Oprah being Satan incarnate.
Oh, she actually one up Satan.
True.
She's the evilest of the evil beings. I wonder what Oprah would think of that.
I have a guess. She'd probably be proud, and then maybe ask Lori why, since she's never killed a child.
We'll be talking about Oprah a bit more later, but now I want to dive a little bit into this whole idea of portals.
Okay.
Do we know where Chad's portals begin?
We don't know where they begin, but let's talk about how the public started to learn about the portals. We started to learn about Chad Daybell having portals or believing in portals or liking portals through the fact that he, according to Lori's best friend, Melanie Gibb, created Lori a portal in her bedroom while she was still married to Charles Vallow, where she could visit with Chad in the portal. Even though he was in Idaho, she was in Arizona, they were both married to their other spouses at the time before their spouses died or were murdered, and they would visit with each other in a so-called portal. And this just blew our minds when we heard this.
Right. Even in the interview with Nate Eaton, and Nate is a true professional. Nate tries to keep his composure.
When he's interviewing Melanie Gibb.
When he was interviewing Melanie Gibb, right, he asked about the portal and he kept a straight face. I'm not sure how, but
kind of
kept
a straight face. You could tell. He asked what we were always asking. Is it real that they believed in portals?
And the answer apparently is yes, it's definitely real. In fact, in Chad's last book called Reclaiming Liberty, he has an entire passage he devotes to portals.
The public knows about portals through Lori's best friend, Melanie Gibb, but we, as we read Chad's fictions, learned that he has liked portals for quite some time. Let me read you that paragraph that John just mentioned from his last fictional book, Reclaiming Liberty. It is about the second coming. That's all Chad thought about. As we now know, he was a doomsday prepper, and this is about what he thought was going to happen towards the end of times. And as we've mentioned before in past episodes of our podcast, Chad has claimed that his fictions are real, that he doesn't write fiction, that what he writes is prophecy. So here we go. Rose went first and told him the information. He typed it in and then smiled. Your records are in order. Please step forward. Rose passed through an entryway and was greeted by a smiling woman who handed her a gold medallion that matched the one Glenn had shown the man. This token is used to verify you're authorized to enter paradise, the woman said. Be sure to keep it with you. Dan and Tyson soon joined her and received their tokens. Then Glenn led them to a portal, a large circular opening similar to what Tyson had seen in some Marvel movies. Dr. Strange isn't in there, is he? Tyson asked. Glenn laughed. No, but it's interesting how close they got it in Hollywood to matching reality. Follow me. We'll be at your new home in no time at all. They each stepped inside the portal, and soon they were traveling at a great speed in a tunnel 50 feet above the shimmering waters of the Great Gulf. Soon they reached the shores of paradise, and Rose marveled at all of the beautiful buildings and parks. She saw hundreds of people in white robes walking or chatting in the streets. Everything looked so pristine and clean, Rose said, as they passed above several sparkling communities. So is this ours? Dan asked, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude. Yes, you actually built it yourselves through the good Christian lives you led on earth. The portal came to an end on the front lawn and they stepped out onto the grass. Rose laughed with delight as the large rabbit hopped towards her. Flopsy, I've missed you. Rose knelt down and Flopsy put her front paws on Rose's knee. This is so marvelous, Rose said.
I love the Flopsy ending because it actually reminds me a lot of Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, where there is a portal and it's entirely fiction and fantasy. That's part of what I want to talk about in terms of understanding the psychological meaning of a portal.
We go to a wonderland.
Well, Chad's observation that Hollywood almost matched reality, I think it's misleading. I think it's actually that Chad's reality was being matched to Hollywood.
Yeah. Can I just say this? He was totally plagiarizing everything. His mind is so simplistic, he would just copy things. There's so many things you see in there. You're like, oh, that's from that. That's from that. That's from that. Did Chad have one original idea?
Or one abstract idea.
Original or abstract? Zombies, portals, been there.
There's a French psychologist who did a great deal of research on child development. And one of the things he discovered was the final stage of development he referred to as the formal operational stage of development. And that stage is achieved when we're able to develop abstract thoughts and think in terms of analogies and metaphors. And he actually estimated that about 50% of people never get to a formal operational stage of thinking. And I think it seems fairly clear that Chad was one of those 50%.
Very clear. One thing I want to bring up and ask you about in that passage was the end result of the portal was getting to paradise, which was a sparkling, clean, white community. Did you see that? Did you read that? What's that about? So paradise is essentially Pleasantville?
There's so many directions I could go in with that, but it's interesting because that idea, a sparkling, pristine community, it's consistent with another psychologist who studied moral development in children. It's consistent with one of Kohlberg's lower stages of moral development, where everything is divided into black and white or good and evil or
Clean, dirty,
right? That things
light,
are
dark.
light and dark. Things are broken down into the most simplistic elements.
Here's that quote one more time. Everything looks so pristine and clean, Rose said, as they passed above several sparkling communities. So this is ours, Dan asked, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude. Yes, you actually built it yourselves through the good Christian lives you led on earth. So in other words, our reward for being good is a perfect, clean, pristine community.
That speaks to some of the ideas we talked about earlier about Chad being a deity, that if you're a deity, then nothing is ugly or deformed or imperfect, right? It kind of picks up on that theme about what's the ultimate form of perfection? What's the ultimate expression of divinity? It's something without impurities.
As someone who thrives on chaos, sounds like I don't want to be in paradise. Sounds like that's not the place for me. I don't know if that's a place I'd like to live for the rest of eternity.
Then maybe you need to rethink that, because if you don't want that, then I presume you can join Oprah somewhere.
You and I have been talking about portals now for months. Have you found any research on any criminal that believes in portals?
No criminals I'm aware of. Like I said, you could find the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland, and you could probably pick it up in Narnia. But there is research on the paranormal. I would consider a portal to fall within the realm of paranormal research. Probably the most interesting study related to a portal in the psychological research was conducted by Harvey Irwin in 1991. It's still probably one of the best studies looking at the paranormal. What Irwin discovered was that there was a strong correlation between belief in the paranormal and fantasy proneness. It's fairly obvious from Chad Daybell's musings about the portal that he is very fantasy prone, which is ironic because he denies that any of this has to do with the imagination.
The irony there.
Right. The irony is that he's extremely fantasy prone. This is all a huge fantasy, and yet he treats it as if it's literal.
Which is what explains Chad Daybell. I don't believe in fantasy. My fantasy is reality.
Right, exactly. That he's mistaking this fantasy proneness for something real, and not only real, so real, he's willing to murder,
Kill children.
kill children over it.
And
Like
his wife of almost 30 years.
Another interesting thought, since this is the hidden podcast and we're going to take you below the surface, way below the surface. Another interesting thought about portals that occurred to me is based on the book The Shining Girls by Lauren Bucas. I might have thought that Chad read this book at some point, but I would guess most of his reading is confined to a fairly narrow
Marvel comics.
Marvels, probably religious readings. This is not a religious book, but
True.
the basic idea in this book, The Shining Girls, is it's about a serial killer who is able to time travel to avoid detection. And so I wonder, I've had the thought that maybe somewhere in Chad's fantasy world, he created the notion of a portal because he felt as if he could get away with crimes.
You know what? There was a commenter on Facebook that had an interesting idea, which is when the bodies were being discovered in Chad Daybell's yard, Chad Daybell was watching police. That was confirmed by multiple witnesses. He sat in his car across the street watching police officers find these bodies of JJ and Tylee and just sat there watching them. And then the moment that the police were seeming to find the exact location of the bodies and were discovering the human remains, Chad Daybell took off in his car. And that was also confirmed by several witnesses. Well, this commenter on Facebook said that she believed that Chad was watching, believing that angels would protect the area where the bodies were, that the police were not going to find the bodies, that she believed that Chad was thinking that there was going to be spiritual intervention and the bodies weren't going to be found. That is a very interesting theory that I think needs to be brought up because I think that that is a possibility. I think that person might have been onto something.
Well, and also it fits in with the idea of a portal. A portal is not just a way to travel through space, it's a way to travel through time. I think part of this portal idea is Chad's belief that somehow as a deity, he can do whatever he wants or commit a crime and avoid detection by traveling to a different time or a different place.
Right.
And so I think maybe in that car, as he watched the bodies being uncovered, not only did he think angels would intervene, but he thought maybe he could just jump in the portal and head away.
Car portal down the street, which, by the way, he didn't get very far. They pulled him over and he pulled over when they turned their lights on.
Too bad his portal was defective.
Like most things in Chad's life.
Before we finish some of our thoughts on portals, I have to tell this story about our son. We were eating dinner one night and we were talking about portals and he didn't understand it. And I tried to explain it to him. At the time, the belief was, and I think this was still true, I think Melanie Gibb mentioned this, that the portal was in Chad's closet. I picture parting your clothes, looking at a bullseye, like a target bullseye on the end of the closet, and then you get like some type of running start, and you just jump into the portal, and you're gone. That's Hollywood, right? That's Marvel. We were talking about this idea of the portal, and I talked about it being in the back of the closet, and the target bullseye was there, and he said, "But Daddy, wouldn't that hurt?" He didn't say it exactly like this. He said, "But Daddy, wouldn't that hurt his head?" And I think he was thinking of it like a bike, that if he fell from his bike, he would have to wear a helmet. He said, "Doesn't he need a helmet?"
He asked if he wore a helmet. I think what he was trying to understand was why would he hit his head? He should be wearing a helmet. He should be wearing a helmet if this is how it works.
Right, because he has to wear a helmet when he rides his strider, and he understands the importance of having a helmet when you hit your head. And the way I was explaining the portal was Chad would launch himself into this target bullseye in the back of his closet and just somehow apparently find himself going from Rexburg to Hawaii, as he described in the passage in the book. Even a 3-year-old was astute enough to recognize that jumping into a portal might present problems.
Right, that one should wear a helmet when
Right.
using their portal.
And it's pretty good advice. Now that we reflect on it, I think Chad probably would have been a lot better off if he had worn a helmet. One of the comments on a blog I wrote that talked about this story was, well, maybe he had a traumatic brain injury because he didn't wear a helmet.
Maybe so, not wearing a helmet, entering his portal. And John did just mention his blog post, so I'll quickly say this. In our last episode, we said we were going to have his blog post up with a fabulous new episode. Well, here is a new episode, but the truth is we moved this week, and it was hard, to say the least. I think sometimes John and I weren't very happy with each other while moving either.
Moving stressful. Here we are doing our podcast
Connecting again.
on a bunch of Home Depot medium-sized boxes with tape on them, and we still don't know what's in them because our father-in-law, who was very helpful, packed them but forgot to mark a bunch of boxes. So if he's listening to this, I wish I could tell him what boxes that our laptop is now perched upon. But
We love you, Dad.
yeah, thanks for the help. I think before we move on from portals, there's just one final thought I have to mention, which has been bothering me a lot, and that is, can Chad use his portal in jail? Is he visiting Lori's cell through his portal, or does it somehow get disabled?
It's a good question. According to multiple sources, they are both spending a lot of time in their separate cells reading scriptures. It was reported that on the last day of the world, last week, Wednesday, that they both continued to do what they always do, which is reading religious books. And that's a good question. Are they visiting each other? And do they have a closet in prison? Can the portal be set up somewhere that's not a closet?
Can you paint the target bullseye on a bunch of cinder block walls and get the same result?
I don't know. Anyone have any ideas? In fact, anyone listening, let us know your thoughts on how you think Chad and Lori's portals work, because we'd love to hear your ideas. We're still figuring this out.
The portal piece is just going to remain an obsession for a while because it's so bizarre. Let's use that as a segue into the next piece of this puzzle,
We love a good segue.
and that's Oprah.
Oprah. I love Oprah, by the way. John, I think, knows this. Maybe not. I came from the Oprah generation. The girl who came home on a Thursday from high school and sat and watched Oprah at 4 p.m. and didn't miss a show. I was raised on Oprah. I love Oprah.
And I wasn't, but I did watch a few episodes here and there. I thought it was interesting. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So what is it about Oprah that apparently gets under Chad and Lori's skin?
I have a few ideas.
Okay.
Well, one thing we both know about Lori and Chad is they had delusions of grandeur, that they believed they were powerful, that they believed that they were leaders of the 144,000, the New Jerusalem. They would lead children warriors to fight for righteousness. To me, so my thoughts are that Oprah is a powerful woman and it comes down to jealousy. It's as simple as that. Oprah has to be dark because people look to her for advice and think that she's wonderful and she's rich and she's famous. These two had a thing about fame. They love talking about celebrities, rating celebrities light or dark. I think it came down to good old-fashioned jealousy, envy.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. In the last podcast, we talked about Chad trying to reclaim some of his power, that during his childhood and afterwards into middle age, a lot of times Chad experienced rejection and feelings of vulnerability and weakness. And so he was seeking ways to feel powerful. And one of those was to create this belief that he was a deity. So I think that's consistent with that. But since this is the Hidden podcast, and since we dig deeper than just the average crime show, I would suggest that the underlying issue here is one of clashing paradigms. Oprah is what I would call, for lack of a better term, I would call Oprah a secular prophet, and that Oprah created what I would call the church of the best self, and that she was the prophet of the best self. And this, by the way, is a very American idea. It's the idea of rugged individualism and self-reliance and independence, and it's the idea of conquering the West and conquering the world and conquering everything. Oprah's focused on the individual. She's secular, and Chad Daybell is not. Chad Daybell's leading a group of pristine soldiers into the Jerusalem that take their directions from God. Everything is predetermined. Everything is set in advance. Chad Daybell's pulling visions back from the other side of the veil with the knowledge of the future, or he was, at least, until he lost all credibility on July 22nd. But the point is that Oprah's worldview and paradigm is in direct contrast to Chad Daybell's. And in some ways it's a threat, because if Oprah's right, if the church of the best self is the paradigm that fits reality better, or at least our current circumstances, and Chad Daybell's paradigm of prophetic guidance and divine intervention is less accurate, then he's wrong. And so I think Oprah without obviously knowing it, but Oprah unknowingly poses a direct threat to all his beliefs and to his entire paradigm and worldview. And I think that's why the jealousy wasn't just over the fact that Oprah was a powerful female who influenced millions of people, although I believe that was part of it. It was more than that. It was the challenge to the very way that he perceived the world. It was a challenge to his belief that there would be a New Jerusalem and he would lead it.
I want to explain this too. On Dateline, it was said by Melanie Gibb that Lori believed that Oprah was the darkest of dark. So John and I interpret that as both Chad and Lori believing that, since Chad was often the one who rated individuals. Right.
Lori talked about Oprah as the most evil spirit based on the rating system, which ties it, I think, to Chad, because Chad was the one who developed this whole rating system, which, by the way, let me just say this about the rating system. So we had Emily Trujillo over visiting us on the 21st of July, the day before the world was going to end. And thank you, Emily, if you're listening to this, for spending some time with us. We know that your husband, George, was unable to make it because George understood more than most of us that the world was not going to end. So he didn't need to be here to celebrate.
He had things to do.
He had real
people to see.
Right. He had real work to do. Unlike some of us that were taking time out midweek to celebrate the end of the world and to buy boats. But Emily stayed with us. And several times we talked about this case. We talked about Chad. Both of us numerous times brought up this rating system and how absolutely absurd it is. We've talked about this before, but this idea that somebody could be a 6.358 how many decibel points do you need here? We get that Chad's system is scientific. Actually, it's pseudoscientific, but he's trying to make it more scientific. I think there's also something else in this rating system, which is legitimacy. He's coming up with more and more decibel places to create the illusion that this system is real and legitimate. It's as if the Library of Congress is categorizing everyone. So Chad takes over that function with his rating system. I would assume at some point he was going to have some minions categorize everyone.
The whole decimal system is what just makes it laughable.
It's so random. I think also the other thing that's interesting about the rating system is the fact that it even exists because it's so judgmental. You're operating from a position of omniscience. Most humans judge to some degree. It's a matter of survival and figuring the world out. But to sit back from a position of omniscience and create this system where you're above everyone else and naming them and judging them and dividing people up into light and dark is absurd.
I agree with you that it's absurd, but psychologically, why is it absurd? What type of person does this?
Person who thinks he's a deity?
Okay, but even if I thought I was God, I would just say, okay, everyone, let's love each other and be happy. I wouldn't decide, hey, you know what I want to do with my time as prophet? Judge people and decide who's worthy and who isn't. What type of person chooses to be a prophet and sit and judge?
A person who's trying to win over Lori Vallow.
Okay, go on.
Part of his goal here was to get the girl. This rating system seems to have originated around the time that he met Lori. I think part of this was an attempt to impress her.
To glorify her. You're a light. You're a prophetess.
Look at all the powers I have. Look at how special I am. Look at how powerful and wonderful. And this was all, in some ways, a marketing ploy to get the girl. But it's more than that. It's also to proclaim that he's a prophet and to get power in the church. There's a lot of other things going on. I think he realized at some point that when Lori started showing interest in him, that he maybe needed a few more gimmicks to make it work.
Makes sense. Disgusting, though, that he got the girl by rating her own child as dark.
Right. I agree.
We've covered portals. We've covered the light and dark scale one more time. Back to Oprah. I don't think I'm done talking about Oprah. What is the relevance of Oprah? More than just the jealousy, but was Chad threatened by Oprah?
He was very threatened because she challenged his perception of reality. She challenged his view of the world that he needed to maintain to not only keep Lori interested and to keep her in the cult, but to proclaim that he was a prophet and that he knew when the world was going to come to an end. I think when I've been able to step back this past week and think about this issue of Oprah and her worldview and Chad and his view of the New Jerusalem, the one thing that stands out for me is how Chad's threat from Oprah in some ways was completely misguided. Chad was still operating within the paradigm that something is either all secular or all divine. Oprah's secular, he's divine. But I think what Chad failed to understand, and this is really critical, is that we all have what I would call a shadow self. And I think this is something that Oprah misses to some degree too, that because Chad was so stuck in these dualities, in this paradigm of good and evil, that he couldn't see that he had a dark side. If you think about it, I mentioned this in our first episode. I said crime was a metaphor for the human condition. The existence of a crime challenges our notion of human existence. And what I meant by that, now I have a chance to explain that we all have a shadow side or a darker side. We're all capable of things that sometimes we can't imagine. And I can tell you this week, having this move and not feeling great during some of it, that it's easy to get angry at the smallest things.
It hasn't been the best week.
Our realtor, actually, Megan Irving, thank you, Megan. She called me at one point during the move and she said, "Are you getting ready to kill someone?" And I said, I think that would be an end to our podcast pretty quickly. No, I've had some bad moments, but no fatalities on the horizon. My point is that there's parts of all of us that we struggle with. And the classic paradigm for this in crime would be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Because Jekyll isn't fully willing to acknowledge Hyde, Hyde's the evil one. Hyde eventually becomes ascendant and takes over Jekyll, and there's nothing that Jekyll can do about it. And I actually think that's a really good analogy with Chad Daybell. That Chad Daybell had this darker side that he had no awareness of, and he was not willing to do anything about it. And it grew just like Mr. Hyde. But at least Jekyll at some point recognized it, right? Jekyll would wake up and see in the paper that Hyde had killed someone, and he had to acknowledge it. Whereas Chad Daybell never acknowledged it. The modern version of Jekyll and Hyde is Dexter. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to watch a lot of that series, but the episodes I've seen have been remarkable. It's a modern version of Jekyll and Hyde. It's the same notion. It's the same idea that Dexter lives this normal life and he's married and in love and has a family, and yet lurking below the surface is this, he calls it the dark passenger. The dark passenger is the same as Mr. Hyde. It's the shadow self. It's that part of us that we struggle with, that we don't want to acknowledge. And if we don't give that side of ourselves any credence or any attention, or if we don't develop any insight into that part of ourselves, it presents problems. The problem with the church of the best self is if we're always focused on perfectibility and the best self, then we lose sight of this other side of ourselves that exists. And if we're always focused on the New Jerusalem or a world that doesn't exist, and in that world everything is pristine and perfect, then there's no shadow self, right? That's when we're in trouble. I think to become a fully functioning whole human being means that we have to embrace the darker parts of ourselves, whether we want to or not. And that makes us whole. That makes us real.
Makes us human.
Exactly. I think my aspiration for this week would be to find your best self, but to recognize the impossibility of achieving a perfect self, that the best self is really an imperfect, vulnerable, fragile self that has a darker side. And that's okay. It's okay to have that side as long as you're willing to acknowledge it and to embrace it to some degree. That doesn't mean it has to take over.
Embracing your shadow self doesn't mean go out and kill someone.
The basic concept behind the shadow self is that human beings, to some degree, are all capable of violence, that aggression is hardwired into our brains to some degree. Aggression is hardwired into our brains from an evolutionary standpoint. It has a lot of survival value. It's been used by different species for many, many years to protect themselves within their small groups. It's been used to protect themselves from predators and enemies. That I would argue aggression is fundamental to who we are. One of the interesting things in this case is Chad Daybell lives in this fantasy world. He's created this utopia where there is no aggression, where everything is pristine and clean and everyone is kind to one another, and it's filled with love and kindness and charity. I don't think that's consistent with not only how we have evolved as human beings and how our brains are, but human nature in general.
Right. The sparkling community that is a reward at the end of our good Christian lives is his fantasy. It's not even, is it even possible?
It might be possible if his world came to pass, but in terms of this world, in terms of human beings living in the here and now, it's not consistent with the way human beings are. I remember one of my forensic psychology professors used to say that the problem of crime gets to the root of the problem of human existence. And what he meant by that is exactly what we're talking about. Human beings have have anger. Anger is a fundamental emotion, and anger is behind aggression and violence most frequently, right? The very notion that human beings can somehow remove all anger from our brains or from our existence is just not feasible.
Well, that's interesting because one thing that people point out about Chad Daybell that know him, there wasn't an angry bone in his body, that he came across as this meek, humble, quiet, subdued man.
Proves my point exactly, that lurking beneath all of this calm exterior is a very angry, vindictive, vengeful side that he had no awareness of, that obviously came out in a different form. Lurking beneath this calm, tranquil exterior was a darker self filled with anger, aggression, and vengefulness that came out later.
So are you saying that when we meet a very meek, humble, submissive person, we should be afraid?
If you look at the history of crime or true crime, oftentimes those are the types of people that show up. Jeffrey Dahmer was one of those characters. Everyone saw him as very passive and submissive and humble and quiet. It's the cliche about the reporter knocks on the neighbor's door and says, "Oh my gosh, what did you think of Jeffrey Dahmer?" And the neighbor says, "Oh, he seemed like such a nice guy." Right? That's what we're talking about. Being a nice guy has value in society for sure. And it's important. We all want to be nice and kind and loving, of course. But we also, I think, need to acknowledge our baser instincts like anger and aggression. And if we don't, it's going to be much harder to control them. The person that doesn't acknowledge those things is the person that's going to go off on a tangent and is going to be the person that flies off on a handle at the smallest provocation.
Is what you're saying then that our best self is to understand all of our emotions, even the anger, even the darkness, that is our shadow self?
Yeah, the anger, the shame, the sadness, all the emotions we don't want to deal with, the negative emotions. In the end, the shadow self is really some version of all of our negative emotions that we try to push away, because those are the emotions that can come back to haunt us. Those are the emotions that will show up and hurt us or trigger us or cause reactions or overreactions. And so what I'm saying is that in Oprah's Church of the Best Self, for example, the basic idea is to overcome all of those emotions. It's not to necessarily deny those emotions. I think the fundamental premise is somehow we can replace those emotions with happier emotions.
Joy.
The joy, right, that we're supposed to be in joy all the time. That's just not a realistic view of human beings. Life is not always easy, and loss and grief and suffering are built into the human condition. There's nothing we can do to avoid those things. I'm simply talking about a more realistic picture of human beings and how in some ways that should be, I think, a relief to us, because we don't have to reach for this unrealistic expectation of perfection all the time, of never feeling a negative emotion and always being joyful and happy. That's sort of the Oprah world. Both Chad and Oprah create these utopias that are false, that don't really represent human beings as we are. Please don't hear me as saying that we shouldn't strive for perfection. There's a difference, that we shouldn't try to attain our goals or dreams, even if they're far-fetched. I think we should. The issue comes in developing the expectation that we're striving for something that's unattainable, like Chad's utopia, unattainable. He's reaching for something that's a pure fantasy. We can set really high goals, but we have to recognize the limitations of ever achieving those, or in some cases, if we're striving for perfection, the impossibility of doing that. We all know that cliche by the positive thinking guru Norman Vincent Peale, who said, "Shoot for the moon, and if you miss, at least you'll land among the stars." I remember having a professor who talked about the issue of positive thinking. His statement was, we should shoot for the moon, but be aware of the fact that if you miss, you're probably going to be jettisoned out into the abyss and the endless void of space for eternity. The Peale comment has value, but it also has limitations, that we can't lose sight of the fact that there's risks. If you're shooting for the moon and you're shooting for perfection and you're shooting for something that's unattainable, there's risks. There's a downside to that. It's not all joy all the time.
And you might not just be satisfied when you're among the stars,
You may not want to be among the stars.
especially if they're pristine and perfect.
Chad Daybell.
Definitely don't want to be there.
My aspiration would be to find your best possible, imperfect, fragile, vulnerable self, and to recognize that's fine.
It's fine not being perfect. It's fine not wanting to live in a pristine, shining, shimmering
A fantasy world. Yeah, not to
fantasy
live in a
world.
fantasy world, to live with the reality of the fact that we're human.
which is what we keep coming back to when it comes to Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow.
Right.
That
Right.
it's okay, everyone, to be human. Raise your hand. I am human, and that is okay. It's beautiful.
And so I've noticed that dinner is wrapping up
On our Home Depot boxes.
on our Home Depot boxes. We're both exhausted. We weren't sure we were going to be able to find the time to do a podcast this week.
But we pulled it off. I've actually had a few people write us and say, when does the next one come out? Before we started this, we said, we've got to keep going. We have to be consistent. But please be understanding that our website is still not up. John's blogs that we've often talked about are still not up in one place where you can find them all. We are working on it while unpacking boxes, and we will have some good news hopefully to share soon.
And as I can see my son, my final thoughts are stay safe and wear a helmet.
Always wear a helmet, which is what we tell our son. I wish people had told that to Chad more often when he was younger. Don't make the same mistake, and always tell your children and your children's friends to wear a helmet, and hopefully we can stop.
Especially if they're going to launch themselves into a portal at the back of a closet.
Our Facebook page, Hidden a True Crime Podcast, or at Hidden True Crime. Twitter is at Hidden Crime, and our Instagram is at Hidden True Crime. And as we've said before, our website is coming soon. It will be hiddentruecrime.com. Until then, please tell your friends we're saving a seat for them too. Until next time, good night.
Good night.
Hey guys, we're going to do one more episode, so stay tuned here. And also, if you could remember to hit like, that's the thumbs up on the thumbs up on the little video that we're all watching. The little video, it could be big for some of you if you're watching on TV. It's little for me on my laptop. All right, we're going to do one more episode, as I explained. We have some really intense, big, long form episodes coming up next week. And I just want to conclude this chapter and start fresh with an in-depth take on Lori Vallow Daybell and revisiting those episodes next week. So we're going to do one more episode here. So we've got a marathon, 3 episodes today. Let's see. Thanks for all your comments. And thanks for that great discussion about your thoughts on Oprah, and that was great. Thank you everyone for the wonderful chat today.
We've been moving into our new home. Crime Podcast. A forensic psychologist and a journalist explore the hidden motives behind unthinkable crimes while examining our deepest fears along the way. This is Lauren Matthias.
And I'm Dr. John Matthias. We're having dinner late tonight. It's around midnight Pacific Coast time, which seems like an appropriate time to discuss a horror story of this magnitude. Thanks for joining us again.
It's been a couple weeks. We've been moving into our new home. We talked to you a couple weeks ago when we were sitting on Home Depot boxes. We're now sitting on a couch, luckily. Still a lot of boxes
that we can't identify.
We still haven't found our utensils, and we still don't have a washer and dryer, but that's coming Friday.
Living in our house at the moment may not be a crime, but it's definitely a mystery.
And speaking of crime, let's talk preliminary hearing. I know a lot of people are ready to talk about Lori Vallow Daybell. We are too, but we had a major preliminary hearing that we first need to discuss, and it's actually been requested by numerous people to please talk about bits of the preliminary hearing, including some recorded phone calls. And we want to dedicate this episode to a self-identified superfan, Felicia Jones.
Thank you, Felicia, for being so supportive of our podcast. I think when we started this last month, I never envisioned the possibility of a superfan, for lack of a better term, but I've really appreciated your comments and your support and your feedback, and thank you. And so we would like to do a shout out to you for being so supportive and encouraging us to continue in spite of the fact that we've both been really busy and moving
And exhausted
and
right
exhausted. Thanks for pushing us. Here it is. We'll do our best. We certainly have some things to talk about.
now. And for those waiting for Lori Vallow Daybell, we will get there, but we did need to cover this preliminary hearing first.
But because we're talking about it, I do want to throw out a little bit of a teaser on Lori, and that pertains to Lori's father, Barry. My take on Lori, and we'll get into this in much more depth over the next several weeks, but my take on Lori is that if we want to understand Lori, we need to start with her father, Barry. And one of the little tidbits you need to know about Barry is that several years ago in 2018, he was distributing flyers for his law practice, but the problem was he wasn't a lawyer. The Arizona State Bar intervened and they shut him down. They issued a cease and desist order and they told him to stop distributing flyers and to stop practicing law if that's what he's doing, because he wasn't a lawyer. His response to them was that the Arizona State Bar was incompetent and barely qualified to practice law. If you step back and think about that for a moment, I think you can learn a lot about Barry Cox. Think about the irony of someone practicing law whose job is to, at the very least, to interpret law, in many cases to uphold law, who's essentially saying he's above the law. Does that mean that he has some antisocial traits? Perhaps. We'll discuss that later. Does that mean that he might be somewhat narcissistic? Perhaps. We'll discuss that later. The question for me that I want to look at closely is, how does Barry Cox influence the family system, the family dynamic that Lori grows up in? And I think the answer to that is profoundly. If you want to understand Lori, I think you need to begin with her father. And just another little tidbit I'll throw out, a connection that we'll be making down the road in some of the podcasts on Lori would be to think about Chad for a moment. I've talked a lot about Chad occupying the role of a deity and thinking he's a deity. When you think about a deity, typically you think about someone who sets the laws, someone who is also above the law. So now I've thrown out a couple of ideas. One, Barry Cox, above the law, a lawyer practicing law without a license. And two, Chad Daybell, a deity, also above the law. We'll get into this in much more depth, I promise. I know I'm making a very weak connection now because I'm not tying those pieces together, but we will tie them together down the road. I want you guys just to maybe chew on that connection for a little bit until we return to it in a future podcast.
Now back to what happened last week, Chad Daybell's preliminary hearing. It was a 2-day hearing, and Chad's case will now advance to district court. The judge determined that Daybell likely committed 2 felony counts of conspiracy to commit destruction or concealment of evidence, meaning the bodies of JJ and Tylee.
Let's focus on a few elements of the preliminary hearing that were of interest to us. Number one, the overall level of dishonesty. It just amazes me. 2 people who consider themselves to be translated beings, whatever that means,
And religious.
and sanctimonious and moral, just lie indiscriminately to everyone.
To police. They talked about how they lied to police.
And maybe they're thinking that the means justify the end, but these are people that have absolutely no problems lying.
We knew from the probable cause that both Lori and Chad had lied to police when a welfare check, the initial welfare check, was being done for JJ, and they lied to police about JJ's whereabouts. But to hear it in the body cam footage during the hearing was mind-blowing, just the depth of their lies.
Who's he with in Arizona?
He's with one of my friends in Arizona.
Oh, you mind if he comes in?
No,
So,
sorry.
who's the friend he's with?
My friend Melanie. Her son has autism. Her name's Melanie Gibb. I gave him all the information on the phone.
We're a little
What is it?
concerned
Why?
because, well, the officers who were here earlier
Yeah.
were checking and they got a bad vibe, that, like something was going on here because
A
What's
lot of
going
stuff
on?
that was going on. If you want to know, it's a lot of stuff. So
Well, that's why we're concerned, because it just was kind of weird.
it is very weird. I've had to move around a lot. One of my brothers is trying to kill me. Not the brother that lives here, obviously. He's kind of my protector. My other brother that was in with my husband, who was trying to kill me for my $2 million life insurance. No way.
now, what?
So a lot of stuff has gone on in this last year. It's been a horrible year for us. I've had to move around. And so I was going to move back to Arizona, put my son back into the school there because I tried to put him in school here at public school at Kennedy.
Okay.
He went for 2 months. We tried it, but he had such a hard time. So I don't tell people the truth about where we are and what we're doing because of those reasons. So I look like a suspect, but I am not a good person. Raised all of my kids. I've done everything that I'm supposed to do in life, but everyone is causing me trouble right now. So
We don't want to cause a lot of trouble.
Does Lori even have a conscience? Like she's lying so freely.
So indiscriminately.
It just flows from her mouth like butter.
I think it's a great question. I think it's a question we're going to answer down the road. I think the shorter answer is that Lori probably lacks more conscience than Chad does.
Dun, 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 for next time. That's a good teaser too.
And they also were dishonest about knowing each other. In the preliminary hearing, there's a body cam moment when Lori, she pretends not to know Chad when in fact they're married.
Well, we had 2 detectives over here
Looking for you a little while ago.
Oh, because I was at the store.
and they ran into probably one of your brothers. In
My
the back
brother
here.
and his friend, probably.
Oh,
They've
who's
been
that?
moving. Chad.
Chad from around here?
Mhm.
What's his last name? Yeah, okay. Chad
Uh-huh.
the Daybell?
He's an author.
Doesn't he live like out in the, isn't that the Chad Bell that, did his wife pass away recently?
Presumably, if you're married to someone,
You usually know them pretty well.
especially if you're going to ride on a chariot to the end of the world with them, right? You presume they know them. What was interesting to me about this fact was the lack of planning, the arrogance of these people. You would think that when the police showed up, they'd have some reasonably consistent story about what happened, and they don't. There's no planning at all. There's no strategy here. If Lauren and I were to commit some horrendous
If you
crime,
and I planned a murder,
right? If we planned a murder, if
we would
planned,
have a decent plan, I
we
think.
would probably be on the same page
I think so.
about what happened, or at least we'd have some discussion. When you go to the I don't know that person and have their number and you're married, it probably isn't going to look good.
It would imply that they really thought they were just going to get away with this.
Well, not only get away with it, I think it also shows to some large extent that they did believe that the world was coming to an end. That if the world's coming to an end, why bother with getting your story straight?
Or that the Lord would protect them. I think that's part of their big theory too, is that the Lord would protect them.
Right, just like he was going to protect Chad when the bodies were being discovered on his property.
For him to lie to police, just the irony there. He'll lie straight to a police officer's face despite believing in this rigid black and white religious view of the world. But like Chad always does, he has an excuse, which I'm sure was, well, sometimes you have to lie for the Lord's sake.
Right, he's going to testify.
Starts everything with, I testify.
I just want to testify.
Right, he's going to testify that it was what he had to do for the Lord.
Another interesting element of the preliminary hearing to me, and it's something a lot of you have asked questions about, is the Melanie Gibb call. When she called Chad and Lori and challenged them on the whereabouts of JJ.
For people to understand this call, again, the children at this time were still missing. Their bodies had not been found. Lori and Chad left the day after the welfare check. They went to Hawaii and did not tell anyone where they were going. They were married. The children were missing. And Melanie Gibb had been requested by Lori to lie to police and tell police that JJ was with her, which she did lie at first. And then she decided to record this phone call, I'm pretty sure, to save face.
One of the interesting things about this call to me is it shows without question that Chad and Lori are both involved together.
Very involved together.
They're both in on this plan. And so it would be interesting to see if at some point one or the other of their defense strategies becomes to deny that they were in on it, or maybe to scapegoat Alex Cox. Chad's denial of knowing Lori early on actually may be a bit of a precursor to that. At the end of the preliminary hearing, his lawyer was starting to hint at the fact that Alex Cox and Lori had a quote special unquote relationship. It implies that Chad's defense attorney may at some point start moving in the direction of separating Chad from Lori and Alex and try to pin the entire murderous scheme on them.
Alex and Lori, brother and sister. Here's some of that call now.
This is a recording on December 8th, at 3:43 p.m. And I am calling Chad Daybell's phone number, and hopefully I will be talking to both of them, Chad and Lori. So here goes the phone call.
Hello, sweet Melanie.
Hi, Chad. Hey, Lori. How are
Hey,
you?
let me put on speaker.
Oh, okay.
All right.
We're enough with the phone.
How are you guys?
We're okay. How are you doing, babe?
I'm doing pretty good, thanks. I was wondering, where are you guys?
We're just hanging out.
Hanging out? Are you in Idaho?
We're
No.
near Idaho.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to ask you a question, if you don't mind, Lori.
Yeah, of course, honey.
I want to know, you remember we talked about JJ going to Kay's house, and you told me they went there, and now he's not there? I was wondering what happened.
Well, I had to move him somewhere else because of her actions. So
Was she doing something? Like, was she trying to come get him or something, or like trying to kidnap him?
well, she said that lots of times before, but
Okay. When I asked Chad the other day, I was like, hey, where is JJ? And he said, for my security, he didn't want me to know. So is there a reason I should be in danger to know where he is?
no, it's nobody. It's his danger. It's the danger that there's people after me.
Okay.
We
So
just felt that if you knew, that puts you in a danger.
well, just in a bad position.
Yeah, bad position.
Everybody, if they don't know anything, then they don't have to say they know.
Right. So you're just worried. Okay.
I'm just to keep him protected and
And keep you protected.
keep everybody else good.
I appreciate that. Well, I was wondering why you told the police why he was with me.
This entire call is 20 minutes long, and we'll have the full call on our Facebook page, Hidden a True Crime Podcast, or at Hidden True Crime. But one thing that happened a lot during this conversation was argument over scripture. Take a listen.
Did he hide?
He had to hide. He had to hide because they were so. Everybody was killing everybody in this society. Everybody was dying. They were killing all the Nephites.
Well, and the scriptures had to hide in the cavity of a rock by day and go out by night.
The prophets did.
They did.
Yeah. Yet you should have been faithful, and he would have extended his arm and supported you against all the fiery darts of the adversary. He would have been with you in every trouble. So when we work with the Lord and are obedient, he's going to protect us from adversarial darts and all kinds of negativity. But when we open the door to Satan, he comes in and then he attacks, and then he takes away to make it look like somebody else took it away. But that's not how God works. He doesn't work in darkness.
I agree with you 100%. And that's what the Lord is doing for me. Exactly what he's doing for me.
Oh, it just
We
sounds
have not
weird.
opened the door for darkness, Mel. Darkness is knocking on the door all the time because that's the way dark works with the light.
A lot of this call is sitting in Sunday school, sitting in church, and listening to people debate the truthfulness of various scriptures. I remember when I was in Sunday school and I was 10 years old, that some of my peers would have these types of debates.
How old were you again?
10-ish?
Exactly. 10. It was a little bit like listening to children to me. Very juvenile in a lot of ways, but I guess that's this entire case.
That goes back to some of the observations we've made about how literal the conversations are between them and how literal they interpret the world. We talked about this to a large degree in our third episode about Chad Daybell's closed-mindedness. And I think that theme gets repeated over and over. We see it in this call. We see references to the end of the world. We see talk about what scripture's right and whether Moroni did so-and-so and whether...
My favorite part was when Melanie uses a scripture against Lori about Korihor, and Korihor is the Antichrist in the Book of Mormon. And Lori gets so offended. And she says, "Are you kidding me right now? You're calling me Korihor?" Here's that part.
Carnal and natural desires. That's what influenced him. And he was very,
That's
very
me? Carnal
deceiving.
natural desires?
Well, honey, you got a lot of natural desires. We all know that.
That's what you think is me, Cora? Are you kidding me right now?
I think both of you have similarities. It's in the scriptures. It's in the scriptures. And the scriptures are very powerful.
Yes, they are. I live by the scriptures, as you know.
I know, but we can wrest the scriptures for our own vain glory.
I wrested the scriptures?
We can do that. And I feel that you have to see our belief systems.
Do I wrest the scriptures? Is that what you're accusing me of at this point?
I feel that you have.
That's one of my favorite parts is they're like 12 years old and calling each other names and getting offended. When remember, there are 2 missing children, but not only missing, at this point, they have been murdered and buried in Chad's backyard while they're arguing over scripture meaning.
Right. And there's a lot of gaslighting going on in this conversation. Lori constantly challenges Melanie's perceptions and constantly tells her that she's turning on her.
Here's one example of gaslighting when Melanie brings up a concern and Lori's response is, you know me, Mel, you know me.
So I can tell that you're just adversarial, Mel. I love you. I'm sorry that you feel this way.
Because I actually do care. I'm sharing what I feel. It doesn't feel right. I don't have peace about it. I never have felt 100% peace about it. I always felt like a little weird in my stomach about all these things.
You know me, Mel. You know me. This does not sound like you. This sounds like you've been influenced by somebody dark who wants you to believe dark things and have fear of the celestial world.
I don't have fear.
You obviously do.
No, I have a peace of conscience and I can see clearly.
So in a lot of ways, I know I referred to conversations I remember having as a 10-year-old, but I also think it's as if these 3 had just watched a Marvel movie like Iron Man, and now they think it's the truth. And they're debating the reality of the suit, and they're debating the mechanics of the suit, and they're debating whether Tony Stark can transform the world, and they're debating fiction, essentially. They're creating this fiction, and then they're living in it, and they're debating it. They don't know better to step outside of this framework and to evaluate it from a rational perspective.
What would be a rational way to look at that?
To have some element of self-reflection, to have some element of saying, hey, what if there's other perspectives here? What if the world isn't going to come to an end? What if Korihora is a metaphor?
That would never cross their minds.
Exactly my point. And that's why they're in that predicament. Another interesting tidbit in that call was Melanie referencing Chad's opening dark portals.
You would have been supported if you had not opened dark portals and dark junk. You would have been safe.
I know we keep talking about the portals, but when Melanie said that, it actually led me to believe that Melanie was all in on this scheme, that Melanie was all in this cult, because the way she mentioned the portal, it sounded as if she believed it.
You would have been supported if you had not opened dark portals.
When she did her interview with Nate Eaton, she stepped back from that a bit and thought that the portals were strange. But in that call in December, she's talking as if the portals are real. There's some element of involvement here with Melanie that's not being acknowledged. I think that Melanie's knowledge, perhaps, and her involvement in Chad's cult is probably more than we're aware of. I think she's minimized a lot of this, and I think she probably knows a great deal more than she's letting on. And that slip, that acknowledgement about opening dark portals suggests that she believes it, and that she only challenged that, refuted that when it became apparent the portal was absurd.
Which only became apparent after 2 children were murdered. John knows I have my issues with Melanie Gibb. I am very, very grateful that Melanie Gibb has come forward. I am very grateful that she recorded that call, and I'm grateful that she finally told the truth to police. But some people are calling her a hero because of her testimony during the preliminary hearing, and really, she could have done a lot more early on. What does it take for her to finally realize that children's lives are in danger? She knows what happens to zombies. She's believing this stuff. She's clearly very religious, as you just point out. She's scripture bashing with them rather than talking about 2 missing children. She seems to care more about what's right and wrong than 2 children's lives. And she did lie to police initially about JJ's whereabouts.
Right, which challenges her credibility about everything. Also, she's completely unemotional. We're talking about murdered kids, and we're talking about, at least in December, we're talking about a child that's missing, and she's unemotional about it.
And she believed the kids were dead. In her interview with Nate Eaton, before the children's bodies were found, she said, I believe they're on the other side. They're dead. They've been murdered. So, in other words, she is clearly thinking that something happened to these children at this point, and she seems more concerned about getting the scripture right than where JJ is.
There's almost something disassociative about her response here, that she's more concerned about the intellectual meaning and interpretation of scriptures rather than the potential death of a child.
For clarification, Tylee is not mentioned in this December phone call because Melanie was only asked to lie to police about JJ. The welfare check initially was just about JJ, sadly, because Tylee had been missing a lot longer. So Tylee wasn't even brought up in this phone call, which is another concern to me, because if JJ is missing and she's concerned about JJ's welfare and she hasn't seen Tylee in months and she had visited them and Tylee wasn't there, I also wish that she had asked about Tylee and thought to ask about Tylee in this conversation. She had heard Lori call Tylee a zombie. Why is she expressing no concern for Tylee during this phone call? Is it because she only lied to police about JJ? So she's concerned more about her welfare than Tylee's?
Or does she know something about Tylee that she's not letting on or doesn't want to get involved with?
That upsets me too, that she doesn't bring up Tylee.
Right, and she's unemotional about it. Her concern for the welfare of the children is secondary to her concern for whether she's gotten scripture correct. The other element of the preliminary hearing that was very tragic and difficult to listen to, but important to discuss nevertheless, was the state of the children's bodies.
Yes, so trigger warning for anyone that doesn't want to hear how the children's bodies were found and in what condition they were found.
The difficulty, I think, for us for this one was the way these human remains were found. So it was kind of this, for lack of a better term, it was kind of a mass of dismembered human remains. Burnt, partially burnt. And so we did the best we could. It was kind of hard to recognize, like, what are we looking at here initially? You know, what is this? Mm-hmm. We know there's tissue here, there's organic matter here, and we just couldn't recognize what we were dealing with. But layer by layer, we ended up just excavating all around this mass of human remains. And we ended up excavating all the way around it. And at the very bottom of this mass, we find, this melted green bucket. And then to the bottom, the side of that green bucket, we eventually find a skull. And then to the side of that skull, we find a mandible with some teeth. Those are the significant things that you could finally see and recognize out of this mass.
Okay. Profilers often talk about serial killers' signatures. In this case, I think it's fair to call Chad and Lori serial killers because we're talking about multiple murders here. So I think that's an apt description. When profilers look at a crime scene, sometimes called crime scene analysis or psychological profiling, they look at three things. They look at the MO or the modus operandi of the murder. They look at what's called the signature of the murder, and they look at victim characteristics. The MO is basically what led to the death of the victim. In other words, what was the method of killing? And was that sufficient to kill the person? The signature is what goes above and beyond the MO. In other words, the signature would be something that's unique to a particular crime scene or a particular murder that exceeds what's necessary to kill someone. If you were to strangle someone, there's a point at which that person might die, and that would be the MO, strangulation. However, if you continued to strangle that person and then you broke their neck and maybe you
stabbed them
or anything above and beyond what was necessary to kill that person would then become a signature. And that's important because criminal profilers look at signatures in an attempt to discover who the killer might be. They look at patterns in killings, and those are called signatures. In the case of Chad Daybell and Lori, the bodies and the way the bodies were found provides a lot of interesting information about them. One of the things about signatures is that profilers attempt to make inferences about psychological needs or idiosyncrasies, or in other words, they're taking the way the bodies are treated and they're making assumptions about what would be necessary to do that to someone. What is the psychological element that would allow or need? What is the psychological need that would allow someone to kill at that level? This is also sometimes called overkill. That's where the term overkill comes from. A signature is going beyond the means that might be necessary to kill someone. A classic example of a signature might be you could stab someone one time to kill them, but in murders involving passion, for example, you'll find that people get stabbed 100 times. That's overkill.
Which shows rage.
Shows rage, right. It shows rage, it shows impulsivity, it shows the inability to curtail behavior at a certain point. In these particular cases, if you look at three of the bodies, if you look at Tammy's body, if you look at Tylee's body, and you look at JJ's body, you see an interesting pattern, for me at least, which is that Tammy, in some ways...
Tammy is Chad's first wife that was killed 2 weeks before he married Lori.
Who supposedly died of natural causes, although Chad... when talking to Melanie, Chad mentions that his children were present.
Right. Here's how Chad explained she died in that recorded phone call with Melanie Gibb. Although originally he said it was in her sleep, his story is changing.
I just want to testify that I know Tammy and the conspiracy theories. My sister-in-law's right behind it all, and I hope that you're not being influenced by that dark team.
I don't know who she is. I'm sorry, you said your sister-in-law? I don't even know her.
Oh, I know that she's coming up with the same type of theories. And it's just not true. My own children were there. They testified that Tammy had been getting weaker and sick, and I begged her to go to the doctor. Her heart was failing her. She was physically falling apart, but she hates doctors, and she just passed away. That's how it happened. My son Garth was right there with me the whole time. My kids were at the house within 20 minutes of her passing. There were 2 coroners. They checked her out right there on the bed. All these conspiracy theories just make me sick to my stomach. Just absolutely sick. I know I've been told for years that Tammy would pass away at a young age. And I had no idea that Lori would even be a part of my life. I just knew that my life had 2 segments. And that I know Tammy's on a special mission, and she's with my kids. She's visited them. There's so much, Melanie, that you just have to have faith. And this is not some sort of master plan. There's no way Lori and I could ever come up with this.
His story changed in terms of how Tammy died. But what's interesting to me is the fact that if we assume this is a murder, it appears that Chad killed her to avoid detection, probably through some type of poisoning or some type of chemical that he injected, although we don't know the autopsy report. But my point is that her body wasn't disfigured, that he did this in a way to avoid as much pain as possible for Tammy. There was, for lack of a better term, some concern about her well-being and the amount of pain that she might suffer. And if you look at the other 2 bodies, especially Tylee, which was horrendous, Tylee's body was decapitated,
Dismembered. Her pelvis was separated from her body.
her spine was severed.
Her spine was severed. Her jaw was separate from her head. She was burned.
It's a horrible situation. And even if she was already dead at that point, it's still a horrendous signature. It's a signature that shows rage and dominance and vengeance. And it's in many ways the complete opposite of Tammy. And yet, probably the same person.
And let me say this, we don't know at this point who killed Tylee. It could have been Alex Cox, who's now deceased, or it could have been Chad. But we do know that Alex and Chad were together on Chad's property burying Tylee, and that Chad sent a text to Tammy afterwards saying that he'd been out all day burying a big raccoon that he shot. So we know that Chad was there doing what he did to the body, whether she was dead or alive. He did this.
So if Chad wasn't disfiguring the body himself, he was involved with it. He knew what was going on. There was some speculation that he considered Alex Cox to be a soldier. In that case, Alex was simply carrying out his orders. So Chad would have had a direct say on how these bodies were treated. I guess you might be able to argue that they dismembered the body maybe in an attempt to dispose of it or to incinerate it at some level, but I don't think that's the case. As I talked about in episode 4, I believe that Tylee challenged Chad. I believe that when Tylee found out that she was labeled a zombie and she saw the writing on the wall, she started to question Chad's belief system. I think she started to push back against the deity. And that put Lori in a real dilemma in terms of, does she choose her child or does she choose Chad? Chad probably escalated his vindictiveness towards Tylee at that point. And no doubt that's one of the reasons Tylee received one of the highest dark ratings possible, because he was trying to alienate her from Lori, I'm sure. So it's no surprise, although tragic as it is, it's no surprise to me to see that her body was completely disfigured. It's consistent with my interpretation of the evidence that Tylee probably challenged Chad to some degree. And that's a big no-no when you're a deity who's going to lead people into the New Jerusalem. JJ's body is a bit of an enigma. If we're trying to figure out a signature here, it's definitely more towards the violent side, that the body was wrapped in plastic. The head had a garbage bag around it. A tremendous amount of duct tape apparently was wrapped around the head and in his mouth. And when I first heard during the preliminary hearing the way JJ's body was found, my first thought was that perhaps he had been buried alive. I hope that's not true.
I hope that's not true.
But the way the body was found and the garbage bags, it's peculiar.
He was wearing the same pajamas that he was last seen in, as well as socks.
He could have been poisoned. He could have been strangled. It's hard to know. I don't think it was a kind death. I guess as kind as any death can be, I feel like this was a death that involved a certain amount of violence and aggression. While the body wasn't dismembered like Tylee, where there's clear signs of rage, the body was not pristine either. The bags around his head indicate potentially some struggle. They were trying to silence him. The duct tape in his mouth might indicate that he was screaming, that he was pushing back, that they tried to silence him. Those two bodies show to some degree that this apparently docile, kind, humble prophet that Chad Daybell is supposed to be is filled with anger and rage and vengefulness, and that he'll stop at nothing to have his mission fulfilled. These two bodies show that his signature is actually one of aggression. And it's also interesting to note that his signature changes when it's someone that he feels close to, someone that he was married to for many years. He was more respectful. You might say that he did that because he wanted to avoid detection, but I don't think that's true. I think that part of his rage or part of his signature here is related to the fact that what he would consider blood versus non-blood required different responses.
Although it is suspected that Tammy was possibly going to be shot. We don't know if that was Alex Cox with a gun.
If in fact that was the case, it did appear that someone tried to shoot Tammy and
few
kill
weeks,
her.
or was it a few days or a week before she was actually killed?
That's true. Then the poisoning would be a stopgap measure. That would be consistent with his other signature of a violent murder. So don't be fooled by this supposedly calm, docile demeanor of Chad Daybell. Underneath that facade is definitely lurking a violent, murderous person. And the final piece I want to talk about from the preliminary hearing that really stood out to me did occur in the Melanie Gibb call. And that was Lori's statement that basically Melanie just needed to hang in there because the world was coming to an end and soon they would be with Jesus.
Here's that part of the call.
I don't know what else to say.
Stand Christ when he comes again, and he's coming soon, and we will all stand there, and you will know at that point that he has supported me and has supported me the whole time. and I have not been deceived.
This is proof to me that this whole scheme was based upon Chad's belief system and his status as a prophet and his desire to lead the 144,000. Back in the 1980s, a criminologist by the name of Robert Holmes began to develop a typology of different serial killers. And Holmes essentially came up with 4 different types of serial killers. And I think this is interesting at this point to introduce this research. It'll provide some insight into this case. Holmes believed that the first type of serial killer was what he called a visionary serial killer. A classic visionary serial killer would be Charles Manson. Manson was driven by command hallucinations about killing people. He believed that voices were directing him to kill. A classic visionary serial killer is someone who's psychotic, essentially, or paranoid schizophrenic, like Manson, who has a vision from voices or God or other sources outside of oneself that directs them to kill. So that's the first class of serial killer. That's a visionary serial killer. The second kind of serial killer is what Holmes called the hedonistic serial killer. The hedonistic serial killer essentially kills for the thrill of it. Well, actually, Holmes amended that later. He said there were 3 reasons that hedonistic serial killers kill. One was the thrill, another was greed, and another was lust. In this category, 2 of the best known hedonistic serial killers would be Jeffrey Dahmer and John Wayne Gacy, both of who killed from lust, essentially from their arousal. In the case of John Wayne Gacy, sexual arousal to children. John Wayne Gacy was not only a pedophile, but a pedophile with an extremely violent, homicidal personality who was unable to contain his sexual urges and derive pleasure from raping and murdering children. Gacy would fall into the class of hedonistic serial killers. The third type of serial killer that Holmes identified, and many of these categories, by the way, are still widely recognized and used today to understand the various types of serial killers. The third type of serial killer is what Holmes called the power and control-oriented type. This type of serial killer essentially derives gratification from the complete control of the victim. When this type of serial killer exerts control over the life of the victim, the murderer experiences pleasure and excitement, not necessarily from the sexual part, as John Wayne Gacy did, but from the belief that he has the power to do whatever he wants to another human being who's then rendered completely helpless and within his total control. An example of a power and control type of serial killer would be Israel Keyes. Keyes was very much consumed by absolutely controlling his victims and watching them suffer. There was something very sadistic about Keyes, and I think that fits into this category of the power and control serial killer. Typically, these are your classic psychopaths. These are killers that get a lot of pleasure out of sadistically harming their victims, controlling their victims, watching their victims suffer. This would be Israel Keyes. The final type of serial killer that Holmes identified is now going to land us in the realm of Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow, and that is the mission-oriented serial killer. The mission-oriented serial killer kills because they're trying to fulfill a mission. Oftentimes, that mission will be related to some type of purification, some type of desire to rid the world of a particular class of people. In this case, classic example of a mission-oriented serial killer would be Hitler. The Nazi regime was based upon racial purification. Hitler's goal was to rid the world of Jews who he perceived as being impure. If that rings a bell, it's because in our last podcast, we talked about one of the books that Chad had written where he talked about going to a world of purity and cleanliness.
Right.
There's a similarity there, except that Chad's purification is based upon ridding the world of zombies, which again brings us back to his rating system. We can't seem to ever avoid that. In his rating system, Chad clearly has the ability to preside over life and death by judging people. The goal is to get rid of dark spirits, to retain good spirits, specifically the 144,000 that presumably will be chosen by him, and to create this world that's pure and clean and holy and untouched by human problems or human dilemmas. Hitler was able to orchestrate a significantly larger movement. Nazi Germany was on the cusp of collapse when Hitler took over. I think there was a lot of desperation in Germany at the time. The currency was being devalued. There were so many reasons why the nation was searching for a scapegoat. If Chad Daybell wanted to muster a similar response, I doubt he's going to find it by appealing to people's desire to rid the world of zombies. I guess unless you think The Walking Dead is real.
Melanie Gibb and Lori seem to.
Right. If you take The Walking Dead to be factual, then perhaps you might, jump in on Chad's cult. But if not, then you're probably going to resist joining a cult that thinks that portals are cool and zombies are the answer to cleaning up the world. When you think about Chad as a mission-oriented serial killer, there's a massive irony here, which is that Chad's trying to create this pure world in the afterlife, and he's doing it through the most impure means of purification possible, which is murder, right? What could be more impure than murder, than dead bodies, than dismembered bodies, right? It's a huge paradox. This is someone who lacked any insight or self-knowledge whatsoever to realize that the means to getting to that world, according to him, is probably the most immoral, impure type of behavior that any human being could engage in. And he had no problem doing it.
Right.
Thinking of himself as a deity obviously helped. That he, as I said in the beginning of this podcast, that if you're a deity, you make the rules.
Well, this is why he's also a terrorist.
I'll be talking a lot about that analogy with terrorism when we talk about Lori in some future episodes, by the way. So stay tuned. We will get to Lori. So before we sign off, a few of our listeners have pointed out our podcast seems to have some value to them because it's not only about crime. The crime is a vehicle through which we can talk about the human condition and even the positive side of people. We're trying to end with an aspiration that looks at crime, but then goes beyond crime and maybe helps us think about human beings in general. I want to do that again. When I was in grad school, I developed a friendship with another future psychologist at the University of Southern California. When he left grad school, he went into private practice for a number of years, and then he became disgruntled with private practice, and he felt that life coaching was the way to go because he felt like he wasn't addressing enough of the positive facets of human beings, that clinicians typically, myself included, we spend a lot of time dealing with the dark side of people and with problems and pathology, and that gets hard. I talked to him about switching over to life coaching, and I asked him, what's your focus going to be? What is it you want to really help people with? And he told me that he believed working on people's missions was the most important thing, that he wanted people to develop really clear missions about their lives, much like a company. So I'm sure all of us at some point have had to sing the company song, whether we liked it or not. Getting back to mission-oriented organizations was a massive movement in like the late 90s, early 2000s. I think that's less true today. But at the time he was doing this, it was around that time. And when companies were all talking about getting mission-focused, developing missions, he thought that was a great idea. Why don't I just apply this to human beings? So everybody that came to see him, he would say, what's your mission? What's your goal? What's your purpose in life? And I think there's some value in that for sure. I think all of us need to have some sense of purpose, probably some type of mission if we can. I think that's helpful. But here's my critique. What if you become so wrapped up in your mission that there's no room for flexibility? What if that mission takes over your life, like Chad Daybell? What if that mission consumes you? What if that mission involves murdering children at some point and you're so wrapped up in that mission, you don't even see it? You don't even acknowledge it. What's the risk in that? I think my caveat to my friend, the life coach, I don't know if you're listening, maybe you are, would be you can have a mission, but I would highly recommend you keep that mission flexible. That's what I call resiliency. Resiliency is about having a mission and a purpose, but building some flexibility. Life changes quickly. Everything changes quickly. Nothing lasts forever. I think our missions should reflect the fact that our goals are going to change. Our life is going to change in unexpected ways. If your mission is something that really resonates with you, I say stay with it. but also stay open to the fact that when it becomes clear that your New Jerusalem isn't going to happen, you need to adapt. You need to change that mission. When I'm talking about this now, I'm also thinking about a famous Charles Dickens character, Ebenezer Scrooge. The reason I'm thinking about that is because Scrooge had a very clear mission in life, which was to make money and to run a successful business. He didn't really care about much else. For Scrooge, one of the great lessons he learned was that his employees mattered, and that specifically the child of one of his employees, Tiny Tim, mattered a lot. When the ghost of Christmas future takes Scrooge into the future, what he's trying to make clear to Scrooge is that his legacy, whether he likes it or not, involves children. Tiny Tim becomes a metaphor for a world in which children are not only disabled, Tiny Tim is disabled, but a world in which children are impoverished. I think part of what Dickens is trying to say is that the future of any society is highly dependent upon children. Even if we don't have kids, as Scrooge didn't. Scrooge realized that. Scrooge had to change his mission to recognize the importance of children for building a viable community and a viable future. And so I think one of the tragedies of this case, maybe the biggest tragedy of this case, is the fact that children were murdered for no reason. And that in some ways, when we have a mission that neglects or overlooks the importance of children, whether we have them or not, is when we neglect or overlook the importance of children, in some ways, we're overlooking not only our legacy, but the ability of our community to survive into the future. I think that's what Dickens, knowingly or unknowingly, is really getting at. Again, the tragedy of this case is that their mission had no concern for the kids. In fact, was willing to go so far as to kill them, to murder them, to prove that the New Jerusalem took precedence over everything else. The obvious question I would have for anyone who's trying to develop a mission or an important mission would be, does it in some ways incorporate something pro-social about the future? Whether we want to acknowledge it or not, children are a part of that future. Whatever else happens to society, there can't be a future without acknowledging the importance of the children in our society. In fact, I would say if we don't protect our kids, what's left? What else do we have? If I had a chance to revisit this issue with my life coach friend, I think I might ask him, what if Chad and Lori Daybell walked into your office with their mission? How would you handle that? Would you see that as a positive scenario? Would you try to change their mission? And why would you do that? After all, it's their mission. It's the thing they're most passionate about, right? How would you handle that? Is it ever okay to have a mission where killing children is acceptable? Is it ever permissible to have a mission where killing thousands of people, if you're a terrorist, is acceptable? As a life coach, is it your job to promote that mission, or is it your job to change it?
Well, I would hope it would be to change it. But do
Well,
you change it to another mission?
Right. And then whose mission is it?
I mean, what would you do?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't be as wrapped up in promoting a mission.
And this is why.
Right. I might endorse having a mission to some degree if that's what the person is invested in. But I think I might challenge it to see if it's consistent with what they really value. I think the real trick here is getting people to reflect deeply on who they are and what they really value and whether the mission's consistent with that. So I think in the end, Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow lost sight of that. They lost sight of who they really were. And that's something I'm going to be talking a lot with Lori. My aspiration, if you're going to have a mission, stay flexible, stay resilient. Resiliency is the key. Have the ability to go with the flow, know who you are, know what's your value, and base it on that. Don't lose sight of it. And I think you'll find your way.
When we started our podcast, we had a mission to stay consistent, to not miss a week. But after moving, we realized we had to be flexible. So thank you to those who have stuck with us, even though we missed a week. We're going to keep going. We're so grateful for the fans that reach out to us like Felicia. Let us know what you are liking, what you want more of, which we know is Lori Vallow. She's coming. In the meantime, go like our Facebook page, Hidden, a True Crime Podcast, our Instagram page, @Hidden True Crime. Our website is coming. We're being flexible on that too, as it's taken a lot longer than we thought. And if you want to hear the entire 20-minute phone call between Lori, Melanie, and Chad, we will have a link to that on our Facebook page. Again, it's Hidden a True Crime Podcast or at Hidden True Crime. Go check that out. In addition to those that need a bit more backstory or want to keep the timeline very clear because you have a mind like mine and you're a journalist and you just need all the details, Tylee's aunt has put together an incredible timeline. I'm going to have a link to that timeline that you can see also on our Facebook page. So go check out both the link to the entire 20-minute phone call as well as this in-depth detailed timeline of everything that has happened with this case. Thank you to those that are sharing with your friends that we have a seat for them as well at our dinner table.
Dinner's wrapping up. We're finishing dessert. I want to reiterate the importance of staying safe and wearing a helmet and trying to stay out of portals if you can.
If you do find yourself in a portal, stay flexible. We can get out of there. It's never too late to find your way out.
If you do find yourself in a portal, try as hard as you can not to have that portal transport you to Chad Daybell's utopian world.
Just get out. Stop, drop, and roll.
From the portal.
From the portal. It is not too late to redirect your mission and get out. Stay flexible.
We'll even provide you, upon request, with our 3-year-old's helmet.
Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great week and good night.
Good night.
Hey everyone, I'm going to conclude today. Please share our podcasts with people. It means so much to us. They can listen here on YouTube, or they can also listen where they listen to podcasts. It's our very first season, our first episodes on our Hidden True Crime podcast. So you can listen either place. Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day. We'll continue this on Monday. And then, let me remove this. Hold on. We'll continue this on Monday, this series. And then we will, there we go. And then tomorrow night, we'll be covering Corey Richins. Dr. John is going to discuss Corey. He's been studying, he's been listening, he's been watching, he's been reading. We have many documents that we'll soon be sharing on our Patreon account, patreon.com/hiddentrue-crime, as well as our Facebook account. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. And stay out of portals. I'll see you.